settle in gently, and allow the day to loosen its grip. As the evening grows quiet, I invite you to drift with me into tonight's story, a story shaped by memory, longing, uncertainty, and the slow movement of history itself. I speak to you as the background historian, not to hurry you through dates or declarations, but to walk beside you at an unhurried pace. This is a story that stretches across centuries, yet gathers itself into a few decisive moments. It is a story of people carrying identity across generations, of land layered with meaning, and of decisions made in crowded rooms that echoed far beyond their walls. Long before there was a modern state, there was an idea. For many Jewish communities scattered across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, the land known historically as Eretz Israel lived not only on maps, but in prayers, songs, and ritual memory. Exile was not simply a change of geography. It was a condition carried quietly through daily life, passed from parent to child, reinforced by hope rather than certainty. As the centuries unfolded, the land itself did not stand empty or still. It passed through empires and administrations, each leaving traces on the soil and in the cities. By the early 20th century, the region stood under the authority of the British Mandate for Palestine, shaped by promises made during wartime and constrained by tensions that no single document could resolve. The rise of modern Zionism emerged from a Europe growing increasingly hostile to Jewish life. Pogroms, discrimination, and finally the catastrophe of the Holocaust gave unbearable urgency to an already fragile hope. For survivors, the idea of safety was no longer abstract. It was immediate, physical, and necessary. After the Second World War, the world attempted to reckon with what had happened and what responsibility remained. In 1947, the United Nations proposed a division of the land through the United Nations Partition Plan. It was an attempt at balance, drawn with lines on paper that could not contain centuries of attachment or fear. One side accepted the plan. The other rejected it. The tension that followed was swift and irreversible. On a warm afternoon in May 1948, in a modest room in Tel Aviv, David Ben-Gurion stood before a gathered assembly and read a declaration. With measured words, the State of Israel was proclaimed. Outside, the streets were already restless. Celebration and apprehension mingled in the air. Within hours, the region was drawn into war. Tonight, we will not rush toward conflict or conclusion. Instead, we will move slowly, part by part, through the deeper currents that led to this moment. We will explore the people, the pressures, the hopes, and the consequences that shaped the foundation of a state whose creation still reverberates across the modern world. For now, take a breath. Let the weight of the day fade. In the quiet that follows, we begin our journey together. Part 1: A Land Remembered. Before there was a declaration, before borders were drawn or flags were raised, there was memory. I want to begin tonight not with modern politics or documents, but with something quieter and older. A sense of place carried gently through time. For many Jewish communities across centuries, the land that would one day be called Israel was not experienced directly, but remembered. It lived in stories spoken softly at the end of long days, in prayers repeated until they felt like breathing, in rituals that folded geography into faith. This memory did not remain sharp and exact. Over generations, it softened and deepened, becoming less about specific hills or roads and more about belonging itself. Jerusalem became not just a city, but a symbol of wholeness. Zion became not only a location, but an idea of return, safety, and continuity. To understand the foundation of the modern state, we must first understand this long practice of remembering. After the destruction of the Second Temple by Roman forces in the 1st century, Jewish life entered a prolonged period of dispersion. Communities spread across the Mediterranean world, into Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Some remained in the land itself, maintaining small but continuous presences. Most did not. Yet even far from home, the land did not disappear from daily life. It was spoken of at weddings and mourned at funerals. It appeared in liturgy, facing prayers toward the east. It lingered in phrases like "next year in Jerusalem," not as a plan, but as a promise suspended in time. This condition of exile was complex. Jewish communities did not live only in sorrow or longing. They built lives, cultures, languages, and traditions wherever they settled. In many places, they flourished intellectually and economically. In others, they endured restrictions, expulsions, and violence. Often, it was both at once. Belonging and vulnerability existed side by side. Over centuries, power shifted again and again across the land itself. Islamic caliphates, Crusader kingdoms, Mamluk rulers, and eventually the Ottoman Empire governed the region. Local populations, including Muslims, Christians, and Jews, lived in overlapping patterns of cooperation and tension. Villages formed and dissolved. Cities grew and receded. The land was never empty, and it was never static. Under the Ottomans, which ruled from the early 16th century until the First World War, the region was not treated as a singular political unit. It was part of larger administrative provinces, governed from afar. Life was largely rural, slow, and shaped by agriculture and local custom. For most inhabitants, identity was tied less to nationality and more to religion, family, and village. Meanwhile, in Europe, something new was taking shape. The 19th century brought nationalism, industrialization, and profound social change. For Jewish communities, this era was deeply contradictory. Legal emancipation offered new freedoms in some countries. At the same time, modern anti-Semitism emerged, reframing old religious prejudice into racial and political ideologies. Jews were increasingly portrayed as outsiders even when they had lived in the same lands for generations. Pogroms in Eastern Europe sent waves of fear through Jewish communities. Violence was not abstract. It arrived at night, shattered homes, and left families displaced. Many fled westward or across the Atlantic. Others began to consider a different possibility. Not assimilation, not escape, but return. This was the soil from which modern Zionism grew. Zionism was not a single movement or belief. It was a collection of responses to insecurity shaped by the political language of its time. Some saw it as a cultural revival, centered on language and education. Others viewed it as a practical solution to persecution, emphasizing land ownership and self-defense. Still others framed it as a moral project, rooted in historical justice. One of the most influential figures in shaping political Zionism was Theodor Herzl. A journalist by training, he was deeply affected by anti-Semitic events in Europe and came to believe that Jewish safety required sovereignty. His vision was pragmatic and international, seeking recognition from global powers rather than relying solely on grassroots settlement. Yet even as these ideas circulated, the reality on the ground remained complicated. Small waves of Jewish immigration began arriving in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. These early settlers purchased land, often legally, sometimes displacing tenant farmers in the process. They established agricultural communities, revived Hebrew as a spoken language, and attempted to build new social models. Life was difficult. The climate was harsh. Disease was common. Resources were limited. Idealism alone did not guarantee success. Local Arab populations watched these changes with uncertainty and growing concern. To them, this was not an abstract historical return. It was a visible transformation of land and labor. Tensions arose not simply from hatred, but from fear of loss and displacement. Two national movements were beginning to take shape in the same place, each grounded in deeply held narratives of belonging. The First World War altered everything. The defeat of the Ottoman Empire brought the region under British control through the British Mandate for Palestine. Britain entered the region having made conflicting promises. During the war, it had encouraged Arab revolts against Ottoman rule with assurances of independence. At the same time, it had issued the Balfour Declaration, expressing support for a Jewish national home in Palestine, while stating that existing non-Jewish communities should not be harmed. These statements were carefully worded and deeply ambiguous. They attempted to satisfy multiple audiences while committing fully to none. In the years that followed, Britain struggled to govern a land increasingly divided by competing aspirations. Immigration increased, particularly as anti-Semitism intensified in Europe. Jewish communities expanded, building institutions, schools, and defense organizations. Arab political movements also organized, demanding self-determination and limits on immigration. Violence erupted sporadically, then more consistently. Britain responded with commissions, white papers, and shifting policies, alternately restricting and permitting Jewish entry, satisfying neither side. As the 1930s progressed, events in Europe darkened beyond imagination. The rise of Nazi Germany transformed Zionism from a political movement into an urgent lifeline for many. Refugees sought entry, often blocked by immigration quotas. Ships were turned away. Doors closed. By the time the Second World War ended, the world faced an unbearable reckoning. The Holocaust had destroyed entire communities. Survivors wandered displaced persons camps with nowhere to go. The question of a Jewish homeland was no longer theoretical. It was immediate. This is where Part 1 gently comes to rest. We have not yet reached declarations or wars, but we have arrived at the edge of inevitability. Memory, fear, hope, and power have all gathered in one place. In the stillness of this moment, history is holding its breath. As we move softly onward, we will step into the post-war world, where international decisions and human desperation converge, and where the foundation of a state begins to take tangible form. Part 2. After the ruins of the world. When the war ended, it did not end cleanly. Across Europe, silence settled over cities that had lost their voices. Entire neighborhoods stood hollow. Trains still ran, but their destinations felt uncertain. For Jewish survivors of the Holocaust, peace did not arrive with relief. It arrived with questions that had no gentle answers. Homes were gone. Families were gone. Countries that had once been familiar felt dangerous, even hostile. Survival itself had become a kind of exile. Hundreds of thousands of displaced people moved slowly through a broken continent, carrying what little they had left. Many were housed in displaced persons camps, often on the very soil of former military or concentration camps. Barbed wire remained. Guard towers remained. The difference was meant to be freedom, but the feeling was unfinished. Waiting replaced terror, yet waiting itself became heavy. For many of these survivors, the idea of return to former homes was impossible. In some places, Anti-Semitic violence resumed almost immediately after the war, reminding people that the hatred they had fled had not vanished with the defeat of Nazi Germany. The past could not be reclaimed. The future had to be built somewhere else. This was the moment when the question of Palestine moved from political debate into moral urgency. Jewish organizations worked tirelessly to arrange immigration for survivors. Legal routes were limited by British restrictions, which sought to control Jewish entry into the Mandate. As a result, clandestine efforts expanded. Ships were gathered, often aging and overcrowded, to carry refugees across the Mediterranean. These journeys were dangerous. Food was scarce. Conditions were harsh. Yet for those aboard, the risk felt preferable to endless limbo. One of the most symbolic of these ships was the Exodus in 1947, carrying thousands of Holocaust survivors toward the shores of Palestine. When British forces intercepted the vessel and forced its passengers back to Europe, the incident drew international attention. Images of survivors being turned away resonated deeply. Sympathy grew. Patience with British administration waned. Britain itself was exhausted. The Second World War had drained its economy and reshaped its global position. Maintaining control over the Mandate had become increasingly costly, both financially and politically. Violence between Jewish underground groups, Arab militias, and British authorities escalated. Bombings, reprisals, and strikes made governance feel unsustainable. Britain found itself unable to satisfy the demands of either community, while also facing growing pressure from the international community. In early 1947, Britain announced that it would refer the question of Palestine to the United Nations. For the first time, the future of the land would be debated on a global stage. The United Nations established a special committee to investigate conditions in Palestine and propose a solution. Delegates visited the region, observing settlements, meeting leaders, and listening to testimonies. They encountered two societies living side by side, increasingly separated by fear and competing visions. Jewish leaders emphasized the urgency of statehood, pointing to the devastation of European Jewry and the need for a secure refuge. They highlighted existing institutions, agricultural development, and systems of self-governance that had already taken root. Arab leaders rejected the idea of partition entirely, arguing that the land belonged to its existing inhabitants and that mass immigration threatened their future. Both sides spoke from positions shaped by trauma. Neither felt fully heard. In November 1947, the United Nations General Assembly voted on a proposed partition plan. The plan recommended dividing the land into two states, one Jewish and one Arab, with Jerusalem placed under international administration. The borders were complex, reflecting demographic realities but creating fragmented territories that would be difficult to govern. The vote passed. In Jewish communities, celebration erupted. People danced in the streets, not because the plan was perfect, but because it represented recognition. For the first time in centuries, Jewish sovereignty felt possible, even imminent. The plan was accepted with relief, hope, and an awareness of its fragility. In Arab communities, the reaction was one of rejection and anger. The plan was seen as unjust, imposed by external powers, and dismissive of Arab self-determination. Protests broke out. Leaders declared the decision illegitimate. The sense of betrayal was profound. Almost immediately, violence intensified. What followed was not yet a formal war between states, but a civil conflict within the Mandate. Attacks and counterattacks spread across cities and rural areas. Roads became dangerous. Neighborhoods were fortified. Ordinary life contracted inward, shaped by curfews and uncertainty. The British, preparing to withdraw, largely stepped back. Their authority dissolved gradually, leaving behind a vacuum that was quickly filled by armed groups on both sides. Jewish defense organizations expanded operations, securing supply lines and strategic locations. Arab militias mobilized locally, often with limited coordination but deep determination. For civilians, this period was marked by fear and displacement. Some fled combat zones temporarily, expecting to return once fighting subsided. Others were forced out or chose to leave as violence approached. Each departure carried its own story, its own reasoning, its own sorrow. Meanwhile, Jewish leadership prepared for what they knew was coming. Institutions that had been built quietly over decades now shifted into emergency mode. Plans were drawn for governance, defense, and economic survival. Leaders debated borders, citizenship, and the structure of a future state. Nothing felt settled. Everything felt urgent. At the center of these preparations stood figures like David Ben-Gurion, who believed that statehood, even under imperfect conditions, was preferable to continued statelessness. Delay, he feared, would mean disaster. Acceptance of compromise, however painful, was necessary. As spring of 1948 approached, Britain set a date for its final withdrawal. The mandate would end in May. What followed would no longer be contained within administrative language or committee reports. Decisions would be enforced not by votes, but by force. In the days before the British departure, fighting intensified further. Each side sought to secure territory before the moment of transition. Rumors spread faster than facts. Panic traveled along roads and through marketplaces. The future narrowed into the immediate present. This is where Part 2 comes gently to rest. The world has emerged from one catastrophe and is sliding toward another. International recognition has been granted, but not accepted by all. Hope and dread exist side by side, inseparable. The land is holding tension in its soil, waiting for a moment that will redefine it forever. As we move onward, we will step into that moment itself, the declaration, the sudden shift from anticipation to war, and the fragile birth of a state under fire. Part 3, the moment the world shifted. The final days of the British Mandate passed with an uneasy stillness. By early May of 1948, authority in the land had thinned to almost nothing. British forces withdrew in stages, lowering flags and closing offices, leaving behind empty compounds and unanswered questions. Law did not disappear all at once. It simply stopped being enforced. What remained was a fragile landscape held together by anticipation, fear, and preparation. Every side understood that time was running out. Jewish leaders worked quickly, often in secrecy, to finalize the structure of a state that did not yet officially exist. Committees met late into the night. Drafts were written and rewritten. The language mattered. Every word would carry legal, historical, and moral weight. The declaration had to speak to the Jewish people, to the international community, and to a future that could not yet be seen. At the same time, defensive preparations accelerated. Supplies were rationed. Makeshift airfields were readied. Fighters trained with limited equipment, aware that neighboring states were watching closely. There was confidence, but it was not simple confidence. It was threaded with uncertainty and an understanding of how much could be lost. On the afternoon of May 14, 1948, in a modest hall in Tel Aviv, representatives gathered. Outside, the city moved quietly, as if holding its breath. Inside, the declaration was read aloud. With measured cadence, the State of Israel was proclaimed. The words did not promise ease. They did not claim victory. They spoke of history, suffering, and return. They declared sovereignty and extended an offer of peace to neighboring peoples. They affirmed equality for all citizens regardless of religion or ethnicity, even as the realities outside the room were already pulling in another direction. Celebration followed quickly. Radios carried the news. People embraced in streets and homes. For many, this moment felt unreal, as if the weight of centuries had suddenly lifted, replaced by something fragile but solid enough to stand upon. That night, the war began. Within hours of the declaration, armies from neighboring Arab states crossed into the territory of the former mandate. Forces from Egypt, Transjordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq entered the conflict, each with its own objectives, alliances, and constraints. The fighting that had already been simmering within the land expanded into a regional war. For the newly declared state, survival became the immediate concern. The early days were chaotic. Supply lines were thin. Weapons were scarce. Fighters often lacked uniforms and formal training. Communication between units was inconsistent. Yet there was also coordination, built from years of organizational groundwork. Defense forces consolidated, adapting quickly to shifting fronts and unexpected setbacks. Jerusalem became one of the most contested spaces. The city, sacred to Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike, was divided by violence. Jewish neighborhoods in the western part were cut off by blockades. Convoys attempted to bring food and water along narrow roads under constant threat. In the eastern sections, control shifted amid fierce street fighting. Civilians sheltered in basements and courtyards, listening to distant explosions echo through ancient stone. Across the countryside, villages and towns changed hands. Some were evacuated amid fighting. Others were captured or abandoned under fear of approaching forces. Each movement of people carried lasting consequences. For Jewish immigrants who had arrived only months earlier, the land they had barely begun to know was already becoming a battlefield. For Arab civilians, displacement often came suddenly, accompanied by loss and confusion. The experience of flight differed from place to place. Some left temporarily, believing they would return once the fighting ended. Others were urged to leave by leaders who expected a swift military victory. Still others fled under direct threat or expulsion. These movements would later be remembered, argued over, and politicized, but in the moment they were shaped by immediate survival. As weeks passed, the war settled into a brutal rhythm. Ceasefires were proposed and broken. International mediators attempted to slow the violence, with limited success. The newly formed Israeli forces gradually gained cohesion, securing key territories and reopening vital roads. At the same time, Arab armies struggled with coordination, competing goals, and logistical challenges. By the end of the first phase of fighting, it was clear that the conflict would not end quickly. What had been framed by some as a short intervention had become a prolonged struggle. The human cost mounted steadily. For those living through it, days blurred together. Ordinary routines disappeared. Sleep came in fragments. Food was shared carefully. Letters carried news that often arrived too late. In this atmosphere, the idea of a state was no longer abstract. It was present in ration cards, in improvised hospitals, in the sound of radio announcements read with calm voices against a backdrop of uncertainty. International recognition followed unevenly. Some countries moved quickly to acknowledge the new state. Others hesitated, weighing alliances and regional stability. Diplomatic language often lagged behind events on the ground. Borders were still undefined. The future shape of the region remained unresolved. Yet something irreversible had occurred. A people long without sovereignty now held it, even as they fought to defend it. Another people experienced profound displacement, their political aspirations deferred and fractured. The land itself absorbed these outcomes, marked by new lines, abandoned homes, and emerging institutions. By early 1949, armistice agreements would begin to bring the major fighting to a close, without resolving the deeper questions beneath it. But that lies just ahead of us. For now, Part 3 comes to rest in the aftermath of creation under fire. A state has been born not in peace, but in conflict. Its foundations are laid amid celebration and grief, hope and loss, permanence and uncertainty. As we move gently onward, we will look at what followed the war. How borders hardened, how memory took shape, and how the events of 1948 became not just history, but inheritance. Part 4: Lines that did not heal. When the guns quieted, silence did not bring clarity. The fighting that followed the declaration of the State of Israel gradually slowed through a series of armistice agreements in 1949. These agreements were not peace treaties. They did not resolve claims or reconcile losses. They simply stopped the immediate violence. What remained was a landscape reshaped by war, its future held in suspension. The armistice lines drawn at the war's end were meant to be temporary. They were penciled onto maps as military boundaries, not political borders. Yet over time, they hardened into something more permanent. These lines, later known as the Green Line, separated Israel from neighboring territories controlled by other states. The West Bank came under Jordanian administration. Gaza fell under Egyptian control. Jerusalem was divided, its western neighborhoods held by Israel, its eastern quarters, including the Old City, governed by Jordan. For the people living within and around these lines, the change was immediate and intimate. Families found themselves cut off from farmland they had worked for generations. Sacred sites became inaccessible. Roads that once connected villages now ended abruptly at checkpoints or barbed wire. A city that had long been shared became something fragmented, its rhythms interrupted by barriers and patrols. On one side of the lines, Israel faced the task of building a state almost from nothing. The population surged dramatically in the early years. Holocaust survivors continued to arrive from Europe. At the same time, Jewish communities from across the Middle East and North Africa began to migrate, many fleeing rising hostility or direct expulsion in countries where Jewish life had existed for centuries. Languages, customs, and traditions converged rapidly, often without preparation or resources to support such scale. Housing was scarce. Food was rationed. New arrivals were often settled in transit camps, temporary communities of tents or simple structures. Life there was difficult, marked by heat, dust, and uncertainty. Yet even in these conditions, institutions took shape. Schools were established. Hebrew was taught as a shared language. Civic identity was encouraged, sometimes clumsily, sometimes forcefully. The state emphasized survival and cohesion. Defense remained a priority. Borders were porous and contested. Raids and retaliations occurred along frontiers, keeping fear alive even in moments of relative calm. The memory of near destruction was fresh. Vigilance became a habit. At the same time, leaders focused on development. Agriculture expanded into the Negev desert. Infrastructure projects connected distant regions. Water systems were planned and built with urgency. The state presented itself as both refuge and rebirth, a place where hardship was temporary and purpose enduring. Yet this story unfolded alongside another, quieter but no less consequential. For Palestinians displaced during the war, the armistice did not bring return. Hundreds of thousands lived as refugees in neighboring territories and countries. Camps emerged quickly, meant to be provisional, yet stretching year after year into permanence. Tents were replaced by concrete shelters. Temporary aid became long-term dependence. Life in the camps was shaped by waiting. Many refugees believed the displacement was temporary. Keys to homes were kept. Deeds were preserved. Stories of villages left behind were told repeatedly, reinforcing memory and identity. Over time, a distinct Palestinian national consciousness deepened, shaped by shared loss and political exclusion. Host countries struggled with their own limitations. Resources were strained. Legal status for refugees remained uncertain. Political solutions were promised but rarely delivered. Generations grew up knowing no other home than the camps, yet defining themselves by places they had never seen. The international community attempted to respond. Relief agencies provided food, education, and basic services. Diplomatic initiatives sought resolution but stalled repeatedly. The war had ended, but peace proved elusive. Each side held incompatible expectations. Israel emphasized security and recognition. Palestinians demanded return and self-determination. Neighboring states balanced solidarity with their own strategic interests. Jerusalem stood as a symbol of this unresolved state. The divided city embodied both longing and separation. Western Jerusalem developed as Israel's administrative center. Eastern Jerusalem, including sacred sites, remained out of reach for Israeli Jews. Barriers cut through neighborhoods. Families were divided by short distances made impassable. Pilgrims and worshippers navigated complex rules. Holy places were maintained under different authorities. The city's layered history felt both present and inaccessible, like a memory glimpsed through a narrow opening. Within Israel, debates emerged about identity and direction. Was the state primarily a refuge, defined by collective trauma and defense, or a cultural revival seeking normalcy and integration into the world? How should diverse Jewish communities be integrated, given disparities in background, language, and opportunity? What responsibilities did the state have toward its Arab minority, many of whom remained within its borders after the war? These questions did not have simple answers. Arab citizens of Israel lived under military administration in the early years, facing restrictions on movement and political expression. At the same time, they held citizenship and participated in civic life in limited ways. Their position was ambiguous, shaped by suspicion and exclusion, yet also by endurance and adaptation. For Israeli society as a whole, the pace of change was relentless. Scarcity gradually gave way to growth. Institutions solidified. A national narrative formed, emphasizing resilience, return, and survival against overwhelming odds. This narrative provided cohesion, but it also left little space for acknowledging the parallel suffering experienced by others. On the other side of the lines, Palestinian memory crystallized around loss. The year 1948 became known as the Nakba, the catastrophe. It marked not only displacement, but the rupture of social, economic, and cultural life. Villages destroyed or abandoned were remembered through names, maps, and oral history. Commemoration became a form of resistance against erasure. Thus, two collective memories took shape, each anchored to the same events, each emphasizing different truths. One remembered survival and sovereignty gained against impossible odds. The other remembered dispossession and injustice unresolved. These memories did not exist in isolation. They faced each other across borders, across narratives, across generations. As the 1950s unfolded, the armistice lines settled into daily reality. Children were born into division, knowing no alternative. The temporary became normal. Emergency measures became institutions. Hopes for swift resolution faded, replaced by guarded adaptation. Part 4 comes to rest here, in the stillness after upheaval. The war has ended, but peace has not begun. Lines on maps have stopped bullets, but not grief or longing. States and identities are solidifying, even as their foundations remain contested. As we move gently onward, we will explore how time deepened these divisions, how memory and politics intertwined, and how the unresolved nature of 1948 continued to shape the decades that followed. Part 5: Years that set like stone. The years after the armistice did not drift gently into normal life. They set, slowly and firmly, like mortar curing under pressure. By the early 1950s, the outlines of a new regional reality had hardened. The armistice lines remained in place, no longer treated as temporary by those who lived along them. Watchtowers and patrols became familiar sights. Maps were redrawn for schools and offices. What had begun as provisional arrangements settled into permanence through repetition. Inside the State of Israel, the pace of transformation was relentless. The population more than doubled within a few short years. Survivors from Europe arrived alongside Jewish communities from Iraq, Yemen, Morocco, Egypt, and beyond. Each group carried its own histories, accents, foods, and expectations. The state welcomed them all, but it was not equally prepared to support them. New arrivals were often directed to development towns, hastily planned settlements intended to populate border regions and absorb immigrants quickly. Life there was sparse. Employment was limited. Services were basic. Social divides emerged, particularly between European Jews and those from Middle Eastern and North African backgrounds. These disparities were not always acknowledged openly, but they shaped opportunity and identity for decades to come. Still, the state pressed forward. National institutions expanded. The education system standardized language and curriculum. Military service became a central rite of passage, binding citizens to a shared sense of responsibility. Collective memory was shaped deliberately, emphasizing unity, resilience, and the moral necessity of survival. Beyond Israel's borders, unresolved tensions continued to simmer. Along the armistice lines, especially near Gaza and the West Bank, small-scale violence persisted. Palestinian refugees, living under difficult conditions, sometimes crossed borders to retrieve possessions, harvest crops, or resist what they saw as permanent loss. These actions were often labeled infiltrations and met with force. Retaliatory raids followed. Each incident deepened mistrust and hardened attitudes. For Palestinians, political life remained fragmented. The West Bank was administered by Jordan. Gaza was controlled by Egypt. Neither arrangement offered sovereignty. Refugee camps became centers of political awareness, where memory of loss mixed with growing demands for national recognition. A generation was coming of age with no experience of statehood, yet a strong sense of collective identity shaped by displacement. Arab states, meanwhile, balanced competing pressures. Publicly, they rejected Israel's legitimacy and spoke of eventual reversal. Privately, they faced internal challenges, economic constraints, and rivalries among themselves. The Palestinian issue was both a unifying cause and a source of political risk. Promises were made often, fulfilled rarely. The broader Middle East was changing rapidly. Colonial influence receded. New nationalist movements gained momentum. Leaders sought to assert independence and regional influence. One of the most influential figures of this era was Gamal Abdel Nasser, whose vision of Arab nationalism reshaped regional politics. His rise altered the balance of power and intensified confrontation with Israel. Tensions reached a breaking point in 1956. When Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal, a vital artery of global trade, it triggered a crisis involving Britain, France, and Israel. Israel entered the conflict with the aim of ending cross-border attacks and securing navigation rights. The brief war resulted in Israeli forces occupying the Sinai Peninsula, while Britain and France sought to regain control of the canal. International pressure, particularly from the United States and the Soviet Union, forced a withdrawal. United Nations forces were deployed in the Sinai, and new arrangements were made to reduce hostilities. Militarily, Israel demonstrated strength and coordination. Politically, the outcome reinforced the limits of force in a world increasingly shaped by superpower interests. For Israel, the Suez Crisis marked a turning point. It brought a sense of military confidence, but also an awareness of diplomatic vulnerability. Survival depended not only on arms, but on alliances and international legitimacy. The state sought closer ties with Western powers, while continuing to frame itself as a small nation under constant threat. For Palestinians, the crisis did little to alter daily realities. Camps remained. Borders remained closed. Promises of resolution faded once again into postponement. The idea that their fate would be decided by others became a bitter refrain. Throughout the late 1950s and early 1960s, daily life across the region settled into an uneasy routine. In Israel, economic conditions slowly improved. Infrastructure projects expanded. Water systems brought agriculture into arid regions. Cities grew. Cultural life diversified, even as debates over identity and inequality persisted beneath the surface. In Arab societies, political movements grew more assertive. Pan-Arab ideals circulated widely. Radio broadcasts carried speeches that stirred pride and defiance. The language of liberation became common, even as practical steps remained uncertain. Jerusalem continued to stand divided, a constant reminder of unfinished business. Sacred sites lay just beyond reach for some, tightly guarded for others. The city's separation felt both normal and intolerable, a contradiction embodied in stone and wire. Memory continued to accumulate. For Israelis, the early years were remembered as a time of sacrifice and creation, when scarcity was endured for the sake of permanence. For Palestinians, the same years were remembered as a prolonged aftermath of catastrophe, where loss was stabilized but not healed. Children on both sides learned different histories, marked the same years with different names, and absorbed narratives that shaped how they would later interpret events. These parallel stories did not merely coexist. They reinforced boundaries of empathy and understanding. By the mid-1960s, it was clear that the region was not moving toward resolution. Instead, it was drifting toward another confrontation. Armies expanded. Rhetoric sharpened. Alliances shifted. The foundations laid in the years after 1948 had not softened with time. They had set more firmly, embedding conflict into institutions, memories, and expectations. Part 5 comes to rest here, in a landscape shaped by endurance rather than resolution. The war that created borders has been followed by years that made them feel inevitable. States have strengthened, identities have hardened, and hopes for swift reconciliation have faded into caution. As we move gently onward, we will step toward the next great rupture, a moment when these settled lines would once again be challenged, and when the unresolved past would surge forward with renewed force. Part 6: The Days That Redrew the Horizon. By the mid-1960s, the region was living inside a long pause. On the surface, daily life continued. Fields were planted. Schools opened and closed with the seasons. Radios carried music and news. Yet beneath this ordinary rhythm, pressure accumulated steadily. The armistice lines drawn after 1948 had not resolved the questions they contained. They had only delayed them. Across the Arab world, political language grew sharper. Military parades filled city streets. Leaders spoke openly of confrontation, not always as an immediate plan, but as an inevitable future. The presence of Israel was framed as temporary, an injustice awaiting correction. For many Palestinians, this rhetoric offered hope that loss might yet be reversed. Inside Israel, vigilance never fully relaxed. Border skirmishes continued, particularly along the northern frontier. Syrian artillery fire from the Golan Heights periodically reached Israeli farmland below. Retaliatory strikes followed. Each incident reinforced a sense of encirclement, the feeling that calm was provisional and could collapse at any moment. Diplomacy moved slowly, often failing to keep pace with events on the ground. Mutual suspicion limited trust. International guarantees felt fragile, dependent on distant powers whose interests shifted with global currents. Then, in the spring of 1967, tension escalated rapidly. Egyptian forces moved into the Sinai Peninsula, previously demilitarized under United Nations supervision. UN peacekeepers withdrew. The Straits of Tiran were closed to Israeli shipping, cutting off access to the Red Sea. Military alliances among Arab states intensified. Public declarations spoke openly of readiness for war. For Israel, these developments felt existential. Memories of 1948 were still vivid, passed through families and institutions alike. The population was small. The territory narrow. There was little sense that another prolonged war could be endured without catastrophic loss. Mobilization began quietly, then urgently. Reserves were called up. Civilian life paused. For weeks, the country waited. Shelters were prepared. Food supplies were organized. Children were sent away from border areas. Anxiety settled into homes and workplaces. The future narrowed into hours and days, each carrying the possibility of sudden rupture. On June 5, 1967, that rupture came. Israel launched a preemptive strike against Egyptian airfields, destroying much of Egypt's air force on the ground. Within hours, the balance of power shifted dramatically. Fighting spread quickly across multiple fronts. Jordanian forces engaged along the armistice line around Jerusalem and the West Bank. Syrian forces clashed in the north. What followed unfolded with astonishing speed. In just 6 days, Israeli forces gained control of the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. The scale of the territorial change was immense, reshaping the map in ways few had anticipated. For Israelis, the outcome was overwhelming. Relief washed through the population, followed by disbelief. The fear of annihilation gave way to a sense of deliverance. Soldiers returned home to embraces and quiet astonishment. The nation exhaled after weeks of suspended breath. One moment carried particular emotional weight. When Israeli forces entered the old city of Jerusalem, reaching the Western Wall for the first time since 1948, the moment resonated deeply. For many Jews, this site represented continuity across exile and division. Images and stories of soldiers standing in silence before ancient stones became etched into collective memory. Yet alongside celebration, new questions emerged almost immediately. The territories captured in the war were not empty landscapes. They were home to millions of Palestinians who now found themselves living under Israeli military occupation. Borders that had once defined separation were replaced by lines of control far deeper into the land. For Palestinians, the war was a second catastrophe. Displacement occurred again, particularly from the West Bank and Gaza. Some fled across the Jordan River. Others remained, now living under a new authority. The experience of statelessness deepened, compounded by the realization that the territory envisioned for a future state was now under occupation. Refugee camps swelled once more. Families already displaced in 1948 now faced further upheaval. The sense of permanence that had begun to form around loss was reinforced, not relieved. Arab states, stunned by the speed and scale of defeat, faced a crisis of legitimacy. Public confidence in leadership faltered. Military pride gave way to introspection and blame. At the same time, rejection of Israel hardened. The famous declaration issued later that year emphasized no peace, no recognition, and no negotiation. The language of refusal reflected both anger and paralysis. Israel now stood at a crossroads. The territories it controlled offered strategic depth and religious significance, but also moral and political complexity. Leaders debated fiercely. Some viewed the land as a bargaining chip to be exchanged for peace and recognition. Others saw it as a historic return, a fulfillment of ancient connection that should not be relinquished. Meanwhile, daily realities began to take shape. Military administration governed Palestinian cities and villages. Checkpoints regulated movement. Permits became part of ordinary life. Economic relationships developed unevenly, creating dependency alongside resentment. Contact between populations increased, but rarely on equal terms. For Israeli society, the war altered self-perception. The narrative shifted from fragile survival to unexpected strength. Confidence grew, sometimes shading into complacency. At the same time, the burden of occupation introduced new ethical debates. What did it mean to control another people indefinitely? Could security and morality coexist under such conditions? For Palestinians, political consciousness evolved. The sense that Arab states would deliver liberation faded. Attention turned inward, toward self-organization and resistance. New movements formed, emphasizing national identity independent of neighboring governments. The struggle was reframed as one of self-determination rather than proxy conflict. International reactions were mixed. Some celebrated the war's brevity and the avoidance of greater catastrophe. Others warned that unresolved occupation would sow deeper instability. United Nations resolutions called for withdrawal in exchange for peace, deliberately ambiguous in wording, leaving room for conflicting interpretations. The days after the war were filled with contrasts. Joy and grief coexisted across short distances. Holy sites were reopened to some, newly restricted for others. Maps were redrawn, but certainty remained elusive. Victory solved immediate fears while planting seeds of future conflict. As weeks turned into months, it became clear that the Six-Day War had not concluded the story begun in 1948. It had expanded it. The foundation of the state, once shaped by survival and recognition, now included control, responsibility, and unresolved sovereignty. The conflict entered a new phase, broader in scope and deeper in consequence. Part 6 comes to rest here, at the edge of transformation. The horizon has been redrawn, but clarity has not followed. What was meant to secure peace has instead complicated it. As we move gently onward, we will explore how occupation became normalized, how resistance took new forms, and how the questions left unanswered in 6 days would echo for decades to come. Part 7: Living Inside the Unfinished. After the War of 1967, time did not rush forward. It slowed, thickened, and settled into routines shaped by control and uncertainty. The territories captured during the Six-Day War were initially governed as temporary holdings. Military administrators spoke of short-term arrangements. International diplomats discussed land for peace. Many believed the situation would resolve itself through negotiation. Yet days became years, and the temporary hardened into daily life. In the West Bank and Gaza, Israeli military rule structured nearly every aspect of existence. Permits governed movement. Curfews appeared and disappeared. Administrative orders replaced civil law. For Palestinians, the experience was not uniform, but it was pervasive. Life continued, but always within limits defined elsewhere. At the same time, contact between populations increased dramatically. Palestinians traveled into Israel for work. Israeli soldiers patrolled Palestinian towns. Markets, roads, and workplaces became shared spaces marked by imbalance. Economic dependency grew alongside resentment. Familiarity did not necessarily produce understanding. Often, it sharpened awareness of inequality. Within Israel, the aftermath of 1967 produced confidence, but also a new restlessness. The war had expanded borders and expectations. The question of what to do with the captured territories became central to political life. Some argued for withdrawal in exchange for peace treaties and recognition. Others saw the land, especially areas with deep religious and historical significance, as inseparable from Jewish identity. Out of this debate emerged the settlement movement. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, small groups of Israelis began establishing civilian communities in the West Bank, Gaza, and Golan Heights. At first, these settlements were few, often presented as security measures or temporary outposts. Over time, they grew in number and permanence, supported by state resources and infrastructure. For supporters, settlements represented return and continuity. For critics, they represented entrenchment and provocation. For Palestinians, they were experienced as encroachment, altering landscapes and restricting access to land and water. Each new settlement shifted the future slightly, narrowing the range of possible resolutions. Meanwhile, Palestinian political organization evolved rapidly. Disillusionment with Arab state leadership after 1967 led to greater emphasis on independent national struggle. The Palestine Liberation Organization, which had existed since the early 1960s, gained prominence under new leadership. Its message emphasized self-determination, resistance, and international recognition. Armed struggle became a defining feature of this phase. Palestinian factions carried out attacks against Israeli targets, both within the region and internationally. Israel responded with military operations, arrests, and targeted strikes. Cycles of action and retaliation deepened fear and hardened perceptions on both sides. Civilians bore the consequences. Palestinian communities lived with the constant possibility of raids or closures. Israeli civilians lived with the fear of sudden violence, particularly in public spaces. Each incident reinforced narratives of threat and justification, leaving little room for empathy. The wider Arab world watched closely, absorbing both frustration and resolve. Though Israel's military strength was now widely acknowledged, the loss of 1967 remained unaccepted. Arab leaders publicly rejected permanent Israeli control over occupied territories, while privately reassessing strategy. The language of inevitable victory softened into preparation for future confrontation. That confrontation arrived in October 1973. On the holiest day of the Jewish calendar, a coalition of Arab states launched a coordinated attack against Israeli positions in the Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights. The timing was deliberate, designed to exploit vulnerability and reclaim territory lost 6 years earlier. The initial shock was severe. Israeli defenses were overwhelmed in several areas. Casualties mounted quickly. The sense of invincibility cultivated after 1967 shattered almost overnight. For the first time since the state's founding, many Israelis feared genuine defeat. Mobilization was swift and desperate. Reserves were called up under fire. Supply lines were re-established under pressure. Within weeks, Israeli forces regained ground and pushed into enemy territory. A ceasefire eventually halted the fighting, but the psychological impact lingered far longer than the war itself. For Israelis, the Yom Kippur War marked an end to illusion. Confidence gave way to introspection. Political leadership was questioned. Public trust fractured. The realization settled in that military dominance did not guarantee security or peace. Vulnerability returned to the center of national consciousness. For Arab states, the war restored a measure of pride. Though territory was not fully reclaimed, the early successes demonstrated that Israel could be challenged. This shift altered diplomatic possibilities, opening space for negotiation that had seemed impossible just years earlier. For Palestinians, the war was watched from the margins. It did not directly resolve occupation or displacement, but it reshaped the regional environment. The possibility that force could alter outcomes reinforced the belief that pressure mattered, even if the path forward remained unclear. In the years that followed, diplomacy began to re-enter the conversation. International efforts intensified. Superpowers pushed for stability. Quiet channels opened between former enemies. The rigid refusal of the late 1960s softened slightly, replaced by cautious exploration of compromise. Yet on the ground, occupation continued. Settlements expanded. Roads were built that connected Israeli communities while bypassing Palestinian towns. Administrative control deepened. What had begun as provisional governance now shaped generations who had never known another reality. Children grew up within this framework. Israeli children learned maps that included expanded borders. Palestinian children learned geography through stories of restriction and loss. Education, media, and daily experience reinforce separate narratives, each internally coherent, each largely incompatible with the other. Jerusalem changed visibly. The city expanded beyond its pre-1967 boundaries. Neighborhoods grew. Infrastructure linked previously divided areas. Yet beneath this integration lay persistent separation. Residency rights, access to services, and political status differed sharply depending on identity. The city's sacred significance magnified every change. A construction project or zoning decision carried symbolic weight far beyond its immediate impact. By the late 1970s, the foundations laid in the aftermath of 1967 were firmly embedded. Occupation was no longer an emergency measure. It was a system. Resistance was no longer sporadic. It was organized and enduring. Hopes for quick resolution had faded into cautious realism, shaped by fatigue as much as ideology. Part 7 comes to rest here, within a long, unresolved present. The conflict has entered a phase defined less by dramatic declarations and more by daily structures that shape lives quietly and persistently. What was once temporary has become familiar. What was once shocking has become routine. As we move gently onward, we will explore how these conditions gave rise to new forms of resistance, new attempts at peace, and new fractures within both societies, setting the stage for another profound transformation. Part 8, When Silence Broke into Movement. By the early 1980s, the conflict had entered a quieter phase, but it was not a peaceful one. It was the quiet of endurance rather than resolution. For nearly 2 decades after 1967, Israeli control over the West Bank and Gaza had become an everyday reality. Military administration shaped permits, land use, employment, and movement. Settlements expanded steadily, often described in bureaucratic language that softened their impact while deepening it. Roads, fences, and zones of control rearranged space in ways that were gradual enough to feel almost invisible, yet decisive over time. For Palestinians living under occupation, frustration accumulated slowly. A generation had grown up knowing no other political reality. Many had never crossed the borders that defined their lives. Education levels rose, but economic opportunity lagged. Dependency on Israeli labor markets increased, creating vulnerability to closures and restrictions. Political expression was limited, often suppressed, and shaped by external leadership structures operating from exile. For a time, the region existed in a state of tense familiarity. Violence occurred, but it was often localized. Israeli society focused increasingly on internal matters, economic growth, and integration into global markets. The occupation faded into the background of daily life for many Israelis, present but distant, discussed in policy terms rather than lived experience. That distance would not last. In December 1987, a traffic accident involving an Israeli military vehicle and Palestinian laborers in Gaza ignited protests. Rumors spread quickly, shaped by years of accumulated anger and distrust. Demonstrations erupted, first locally, then across the occupied territories. What followed became known as the First Intifada. Unlike earlier phases of conflict, this uprising was not led primarily by external armies or organized militias. It was rooted in the streets, neighborhoods, and refugee camps. Youth threw stones. Workers went on strike. Shopkeepers closed their doors. Women organized networks of mutual aid. Graffiti and leaflets replaced formal speeches. The uprising was as much social as it was political. For Palestinians, it represented a collective refusal to accept the status quo. Daily acts of resistance disrupted the routines of occupation. The emphasis was not initially on armed struggle, but on visibility, persistence, and mass participation. The goal was to make life under occupation unmanageable, both practically and morally. Israel responded with force. Curfews were imposed. Arrests increased. Military patrols intensified. Images of soldiers confronting unarmed protesters circulated widely, drawing international attention. The asymmetry of power was stark, and it reshaped global perceptions of the conflict. Inside Israel, the uprising provoked discomfort and debate. Many Israelis were unprepared for the sustained nature of Palestinian resistance. The belief that the occupation could be managed indefinitely without consequence began to erode. Media coverage and personal encounters brought the realities of control closer to home. Questions that had once been theoretical became unavoidable. For Palestinians, the cost was high. Lives were lost. Economies suffered under closures. Families endured collective punishment. Yet the sense of agency the uprising generated was powerful. For the first time, Palestinian identity and struggle were centered within the territories themselves, rather than primarily represented by leaders abroad. During this period, political structures evolved rapidly. The Palestine Liberation Organization, long based outside the territories, adjusted its strategy. It sought greater international legitimacy and moved toward diplomatic engagement. In 1988, it formally recognized the State of Israel and accepted a two-state framework based on pre-1967 borders. This shift marked a significant turning point. For the first time, a major Palestinian body publicly endorsed a political solution that acknowledged Israel's existence. The move did not resolve internal divisions or end the uprising, but it altered the diplomatic landscape. International actors took note. The end of the Cold War reshaped global priorities. Superpower rivalry receded, creating space for regional diplomacy. The United States increased its involvement, positioning itself as a mediator. European states also pressed for dialogue, emphasizing human rights and self-determination. The uprising continued into the early 1990s, gradually losing momentum as exhaustion set in and leadership shifted toward negotiation. Behind the scenes, quiet contacts began. Israeli and Palestinian representatives met discreetly in foreign locations, exploring possibilities that public politics could not yet accommodate. These conversations were tentative, shaped by mistrust but also by recognition that the existing trajectory was unsustainable. In 1993, these efforts culminated in a breakthrough. The Oslo Accords, signed on the lawn of the White House, represented a mutual recognition between Israel and the PLO. The agreement outlined a phased process toward Palestinian self-governance in parts of the West Bank and Gaza, with final status issues to be negotiated later. The moment carried immense symbolic weight. Images of leaders shaking hands were broadcast worldwide. For many, it felt like the first real opening after decades of conflict. Hope surged cautiously. Words like peace process and reconciliation entered everyday language. On the ground, changes began. Palestinian authorities assumed limited administrative control over certain areas. Israeli military forces redeployed from some population centers. New institutions were established. Elections were held. Flags were raised. The sense of possibility, though fragile, was tangible. Yet even in its earliest days, the process carried contradictions. The accords deferred the most contentious issues: borders, refugees, settlements, and Jerusalem. Implementation was uneven. Trust remained thin. Extremists on both sides rejected compromise, viewing it as betrayal. Settlements continued to expand during the peace process, complicating Palestinian faith in its sincerity. Violence did not disappear. Attacks and reprisals undermined confidence, feeding skepticism. For Israelis, the process brought both optimism and fear. Some embraced the prospect of normalization and an end to perpetual conflict. Others worried that concessions endangered security. Political divisions deepened, reshaping domestic discourse. For Palestinians, partial autonomy offered dignity but also disappointment. The limits of self-rule were apparent. Movement restrictions persisted. Economic dependence remained. The promise of statehood felt closer, yet still out of reach. The First Intifada faded, but its legacy endured. It had transformed Palestinian political identity, forced international engagement, and altered Israeli self-perception. It demonstrated that control could be challenged through mass mobilization, and that stalemate carried costs for all involved. Part 8 comes to rest in this fragile moment of transition. The silence of endurance has been broken by movement, and movement has given way to negotiation. Old structures have cracked, but new ones are not yet secure. Hope exists, but it is cautious, aware of how easily it can be undone. As we move gently onward, we will explore how this fragile process unraveled, how trust dissolved, and how the promise of peace gave way once more to confrontation, reshaping the conflict for a new century. Part 9: The Promise That Fractured. In the years following the Oslo Accords, hope did not disappear. It thinned, stretched across time, tested by reality, and slowly began to fracture. At first, there was motion. Checkpoints shifted. Administrative authority changed hands in limited areas. Palestinian institutions expanded under newly formed governance structures. Israeli leaders spoke publicly of reconciliation, security, and a future shaped less by emergency and more by coexistence. International donors poured resources into the region, funding infrastructure, training, and development programs meant to support transition. For a brief moment, the future felt negotiable. Yet beneath this movement, the foundations of trust were fragile. Each side interpreted the agreements differently. For Israel, the process was framed as conditional, dependent on security and the gradual building of Palestinian self-rule. For Palestinians, Oslo was understood as a clear pathway towards statehood, delayed but inevitable. These differing expectations soon collided. One of the most visible sources of tension was settlement expansion. Throughout the 1990s, Israeli settlements in the West Bank continued to grow in population and footprint. New housing projects appeared. Bypass roads connected settlements directly to Israel, often cutting through Palestinian land and reshaping daily geography. For Palestinians, this expansion felt like a betrayal. The land envisioned for a future state seemed to be shrinking even as negotiations continued. Each new construction site reinforced skepticism toward the peace process, feeding the belief that talks were being used to entrench control rather than dismantle it. Within Israel, opinions were sharply divided. Some saw settlement growth as a natural expression of security needs or historical connection. Others viewed it as a strategic mistake, undermining prospects for peace and increasing friction. Political debates intensified, spilling into protests, elections, and public discourse. Violence returned intermittently. Attacks by Palestinian militants targeted Israeli civilians, particularly through suicide bombings that shocked and traumatized the public. Israel responded with arrests, closures, and military operations. Each incident hardened positions, narrowing space for compromise. The sense of momentum slowed. Interim agreements were signed, but implementation lagged. Timetables slipped. Mutual accusations accumulated. The language of partnership gave way to legalistic disputes over compliance and responsibility. By the end of the decade, both societies were exhausted by expectation. In Israel, the assassination of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin in 1995 marked a profound rupture. The killing, carried out by an Israeli extremist opposed to the peace process, sent shockwaves through the nation. It exposed the depth of internal division and removed a leader closely associated with Oslo's vision. For Palestinians, the expansion of authority under self-governance brought mixed outcomes. While symbols of autonomy mattered deeply, corruption and inefficiency within new institutions bred frustration. The gap between political leadership and everyday experience widened. Economic conditions fluctuated, often worsened by closures and movement restrictions. As the millennium approached, urgency returned to diplomacy. In 2000, leaders gathered at Camp David to attempt a final status agreement. The issues deferred since Oslo were placed squarely on the table: borders, settlements, refugees, and Jerusalem. Each carried emotional and historical weight far beyond technical negotiation. The talks failed. Accounts differ on why. Some emphasize missed opportunities. Others point to incompatible positions and insufficient trust. What is clear is that the failure shattered lingering optimism. The belief that gradual negotiation would inevitably lead to peace no longer held. Soon after, a spark reignited widespread unrest. In late 2000, violence erupted following a highly symbolic visit to a contested holy site in Jerusalem. Protests escalated rapidly. Clashes spread across the West Bank, Gaza, and within Israel itself. The Second Intifada had begun. This uprising differed sharply from the first. Where the earlier movement had relied heavily on mass protest and civil disobedience, the Second Intifada became far more militarized. Armed attacks increased. Suicide bombings targeted buses, cafes, and public spaces. Israeli responses grew harsher, involving large-scale military incursions, targeted killings, and widespread closures. Fear returned as a constant companion. Israeli civilians altered daily routines, scanning public spaces for danger. Palestinian communities faced frequent raids, curfews, and destruction of infrastructure. Trust, already weakened, collapsed entirely. The geography of separation intensified. Israel constructed a barrier through and around the West Bank, citing security needs. Supporters credited it with reducing attacks. Critics argued it entrenched division, annexed land, and deepened humanitarian hardship. Villages were split. Fields were isolated. Movement became more complex and constrained. Jerusalem once again stood at the center. The city's sacred spaces became flashpoints, carrying layers of religious and national symbolism. Control over access and sovereignty was contested daily, often through small but consequential decisions that resonated far beyond city limits. International involvement increased, but influence waned. Diplomatic initiatives proposed roadmaps and phased plans. Monitoring missions issued reports. Yet violence continued, eroding confidence in external mediation. The global focus shifted toward counterterrorism, reshaping how events in the region were framed and addressed. Within Israel, political attitudes shifted decisively. Support for unilateral measures grew. The belief that negotiation could not ensure security gained traction. Leaders emphasized separation over integration, control over compromise. Within Palestinian society, fragmentation deepened. The authority established under Oslo lost credibility as living conditions deteriorated and statehood receded once more. Competing political movements gained strength, offering different visions of resistance and governance. Unity weakened under pressure. The early 2000s closed with exhaustion on all sides. Thousands had been killed. Economies were strained. Infrastructure lay damaged. The language of peace had been replaced by the language of management, security, and containment. What had once been described as a process now felt like a memory. The promise of Oslo did not simply fail. It fractured, leaving behind shards of hope embedded in resentment and grief. Each side carried its own narrative of betrayal, shaped by lived experience rather than abstract principle. Children growing up during these years absorbed conflict not as history, but as atmosphere. Checkpoints, sirens, and sudden closures became normal. Expectations narrowed. Imagination itself felt constrained. Part 9 comes to rest here, amid the ruins of expectation. Negotiation has given way to confrontation. Trust has dissolved into suspicion. The future once imagined as shared now appears distant and uncertain. As we move gently onward, we will explore how the conflict entered a new phase defined by separation, unilateral decisions, and shifting regional dynamics, carrying the unresolved weight of every moment that came before. Part 10: Walls, Withdrawals, and the Shape of Separation. As the violence of the early 2000s began to ebb, it did not leave peace in its wake. Instead, it left distance. The Second Intifada burned itself into exhaustion rather than resolution. By the mid-2000s, both Israeli and Palestinian societies were deeply worn down, not only by loss of life, but by the constant strain of fear, disruption, and uncertainty. The question was no longer how to achieve peace quickly, but how to survive the present with fewer wounds. Out of this exhaustion emerged a new logic. Rather than negotiation built on trust, leaders increasingly turned toward unilateral action. If agreement seemed unreachable, then separation appeared safer. The idea was not reconciliation, but management. Not healing, but containment. For Israel, this logic reshaped policy decisively. The construction of a separation barrier through and around the West Bank accelerated. Supporters described it as a security necessity, pointing to the sharp reduction in attacks within Israel following its expansion. For many Israelis, the barrier represented relief, a physical line that promised protection from the violence that had defined the previous years. For Palestinians, the barrier felt profoundly different. Its route often extended beyond the armistice line, cutting into the West Bank to encompass settlements and strategic areas. Villages were divided from farmland. Daily commutes became long and unpredictable. Permits governed access to land that families had worked for generations. What was described as a temporary security measure became an enduring feature of the landscape. At the same time, Israel made a dramatic move in Gaza. In 2005, Israel unilaterally withdrew its settlers and military installations from the Gaza Strip. Settlements were dismantled. Soldiers escorted residents out of homes they had lived in for decades. Images of evacuation carried emotional weight, particularly for Israeli society, where the act was framed as painful but necessary. The disengagement was not coordinated with Palestinian leadership. Instead, it was presented as a strategic decision aimed at reducing friction and demographic pressure. Israel retained control over Gaza's airspace, coastline, and borders, but no longer maintained a permanent ground presence within the territory. Reactions were mixed and complex. For some Palestinians, the withdrawal felt like a victory achieved through resistance. For others, it offered little relief, as movement and trade remained tightly restricted. Gaza did not become open or sovereign. It became enclosed in a new way. Soon after, Palestinian politics shifted sharply. In 2006, legislative elections brought a decisive victory for Hamas, a group that rejected the Oslo framework and emphasized resistance over negotiation. The result reflected deep dissatisfaction with existing leadership and the failure of the peace process to deliver tangible change. The outcome triggered immediate consequences. International donors withdrew support. Sanctions were imposed. Tensions between Palestinian factions escalated rapidly. By 2007, violent clashes led to a political split. Hamas took control of Gaza, while the Palestinian Authority retained limited control in parts of the West Bank. This division reshaped Palestinian life. Two separate political realities emerged, each with its own governance structures, security forces, and external relationships. Coordination weakened. Unity fractured. The prospect of a single, cohesive Palestinian strategy faded further into uncertainty. For Gaza, isolation deepened. Israel and Egypt imposed a blockade, citing security concerns. Movement of people and goods was severely restricted. The economy contracted. Infrastructure decayed. Electricity and water shortages became routine. Life narrowed into a daily struggle for stability. For residents, the sense of enclosure was constant. The sea lay just beyond reach, monitored and controlled. Borders were closed except in rare circumstances. The horizon felt physically close, yet unreachable. Time slowed, shaped by repetition and constraint. In the West Bank, conditions differed but were no less complex. The Palestinian Authority governed pockets of territory amid a web of checkpoints, settlements, and military zones. Security coordination with Israel reduced some violence, but also generated resentment. Authority felt partial, constrained, and dependent. For many Palestinians, daily life involved navigating layered control. Permits determined movement. Economic opportunity was uneven. Political expression was shaped by fear of instability. The dream of statehood remained present, but distant, increasingly abstract. Within Israel, the shift towards separation altered national identity. The idea of a negotiated two-state solution remained official policy, but public faith in its feasibility declined. Many Israelis focused inward, emphasizing normalcy, economic growth, and integration into global systems. The conflict did not disappear, but it receded from daily consciousness for those not living near borders or checkpoints. At the same time, security remained central. Periodic escalations in Gaza, involving rocket fire and military responses, punctured any sense of calm. Each cycle reinforced the logic of containment rather than resolution. Quiet became the goal, even if it was fragile and temporary. Internationally, attention drifted. Other global crises competed for focus. Diplomatic efforts continued, but without urgency. statements reiterated commitment to peace, even as conditions on the ground moved in the opposite direction. The landscape itself told the story. Walls and fences reshaped hills and valleys. Settlements expanded quietly, often through administrative decisions rather than dramatic announcements. Roads connected some communities while bypassing others entirely. Geography became layered with permission and denial. For a new generation, this was the only reality they knew. Israeli children grew up with barriers as background, learning that separation was normal and necessary. Palestinian children grew up within limits so familiar they felt natural, even as they shaped aspiration and imagination. The language of peace softened into the language of management. Instead of asking how to resolve the conflict, leaders increasingly asked how to control its risks. Stability replaced justice as a guiding principle. The future was discussed less in terms of reconciliation and more in terms of deterrence. Yet beneath this managed calm, unresolved questions remained. Borders were undefined. Sovereignty was incomplete. Refugees were still displaced. Jerusalem's status was unresolved. Each issue lay dormant, not settled, waiting for conditions that might bring it back to the surface. Part 10 comes to rest here, in a landscape of separation. Walls stand where negotiations once promised bridges. Withdrawals have reduced contact, but not connection. The conflict has not ended. It has been reorganized, shaped into systems that reduce friction while preserving division. As we move gently onward, we will explore how this prolonged separation affected identity, memory, and politics, and how the unresolved foundations laid decades earlier continued to influence a region trying to live with distance rather than peace. Part 11: The Weight of Waiting. By the early 2010s, the conflict had entered a long season of waiting. Not the hopeful waiting of negotiation, nor the frantic waiting of imminent war, but something heavier and quieter. It was the waiting of people who had learned to measure time by interruptions, by sirens and closures, by escalations that arrived suddenly and receded without resolution. Across the region, the structures put in place during the previous decade settled into permanence. The separation barrier remained. The blockade of Gaza tightened and loosened in small increments, but never lifted. Settlements expanded incrementally, often without dramatic announcement. Authority in the West Bank remained partial and constrained. Two Palestinian political entities continued to govern separately, divided by geography and ideology. Life continued within these boundaries. In Israel, daily routines felt increasingly distant from the conflict for many citizens. Cities grew upward and outward. Technology sectors flourished. Cultural life expanded. For those not living near Gaza or the West Bank, the occupation became an abstraction, present in news cycles but absent from personal experience. Security, however, never vanished entirely. Occasional rocket fire from Gaza reminded Israelis that distance did not mean immunity. Warning sirens interrupted ordinary moments. The Iron Dome defense system intercepted projectiles overhead, turning conflict into brief flashes in the sky, followed by rapid returns to normal life. For Palestinians, the sense of waiting was different. In Gaza, isolation shaped every aspect of existence. Movement was restricted to a narrow strip of land bordered by fences and sea. Economic opportunity was scarce. Infrastructure deteriorated under repeated conflicts and limited reconstruction. Electricity and clean water became intermittent, rationed resources rather than constants. Children grew up with the sound of drones overhead, their presence so continuous it faded into background noise. Nights were often brighter than they should have been, lit by flares or distant explosions during escalations. In the West Bank, life was less visibly violent, but no less constrained. Movement between cities required navigating checkpoints. Permits determined access to work, medical care, and family. Settlements continued to alter the geography, expanding onto hilltops and surrounding roads. Palestinian towns became islands connected by corridors of permission. The sense of fragmentation deepened. Political life among Palestinians grew increasingly stagnant. Elections were postponed repeatedly. Leadership aged in place. Young people expressed frustration, not only toward occupation, but toward their own institutions. The promise of statehood felt suspended, no longer imminent enough to mobilize hope, yet too present to abandon. Across the Arab world, upheaval erupted in 2011. Mass protests swept through cities, challenging long-standing regimes and demanding dignity, accountability, and political change. The so-called Arab Spring raised questions across the region, including among Palestinians. Could popular mobilization reshape entrenched systems? Could power be confronted directly rather than negotiated endlessly? For a moment, possibilities widened. Yet the outcomes elsewhere were sobering. Revolutions faltered or descended into violence. Civil wars erupted. Authoritarianism reasserted itself in new forms. The regional focus shifted inward, away from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which came to be seen as chronic rather than urgent. This shift altered dynamics significantly. Arab states once vocal about Palestinian liberation recalibrated priorities toward domestic stability and regional rivalry. Diplomatic language softened. Quiet cooperation with Israel increased in some areas, particularly around security concerns. The Palestinian issue remained symbolically important, but practically sidelined. Israel's regional position strengthened. Without major external pressure, policies emphasizing security and control continued largely unchecked. International criticism persisted, but with limited effect. The sense that the conflict could be managed indefinitely gained traction among policymakers. In Gaza, cycles of escalation continued. Major confrontations erupted every few years, each more destructive than the last. Airstrikes and rocket fire followed predictable patterns. Ceasefires were brokered, fragile and temporary. Reconstruction lagged behind destruction, leaving neighborhoods permanently scarred. Each escalation reinforced trauma. For Israeli communities near Gaza, constant readiness became part of daily life. Children practiced drills. Homes were reinforced. Fear was intermittent but recurring, shaping identity through repetition. For Gazans, loss was cumulative. Buildings rebuilt were destroyed again. Families displaced returned, only to be displaced once more. The future narrowed into survival, ambition replaced by endurance. The idea of normal life became abstract, almost mythic. Jerusalem remained a focal point. Changes in governance, residency rights, and access to holy sites carried immense symbolic weight. Tensions flared periodically around religious holidays, security measures, or political announcements. Each incident resonated far beyond the city, igniting protests or violence elsewhere. The city embodied contradiction. It was presented as unified, yet lived as divided. Its streets carried ancient continuity alongside modern surveillance. Sacredness coexisted with control. For those who lived there, identity was negotiated daily through law, language, and movement. International diplomacy persisted, but without momentum. Statements reaffirmed commitment to a two-state solution, even as realities on the ground moved further from that vision. Peace initiatives were announced, then faded quietly. The gap between rhetoric and lived experience widened. Within Israeli society, generational change reshaped perception. Younger Israelis, born after the Oslo years, had little memory of sustained peace efforts. For many, separation felt permanent and necessary. The idea of negotiation was often associated with danger rather than hope. Among Palestinians, a similar generational shift occurred. Young people grew up knowing only occupation, division, and stalled leadership. The language of liberation remained, but pathways toward it felt unclear. Some turned toward activism and global solidarity movements. Others withdrew into private life, focusing on survival and family. The conflict settled into a pattern of managed instability. Violence was contained but unresolved. Politics moved without vision. Lives unfolded within limits so familiar they felt almost natural. The urgency that once drove history forward slowed into something like inertia. Yet unresolved histories do not disappear. They accumulate quietly, layering grievance upon grievance, memory upon memory. Even in periods of relative calm, the foundations laid decades earlier continued to press upward, shaping events in subtle ways. Part 11 comes to rest here, within this long pause. The conflict has not ended, nor has it exploded into all-consuming war. Instead, it waits. It lives in systems, habits, and expectations. It shapes how people imagine their futures, not through dramatic declarations, but through the quiet narrowing of what feels possible. As we move gently onward, we will look at how new alignments, shifting global politics, and renewed violence would once again disrupt this uneasy stillness, reminding the world that waiting does not mean forgetting. Part 12, Shifts Beneath the Surface. History rarely announces its turning points clearly. More often, change arrives sideways, disguised as adjustment rather than rupture. By the late 2010s, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict appeared outwardly frozen. Borders were unchanged. Leadership structures remained entrenched. Daily realities followed familiar patterns of restriction, security, and intermittent violence. Many observers spoke of stagnation, of a conflict no longer moving toward resolution but no longer exploding either. Yet beneath this stillness, the ground was shifting. One of the most visible changes came not between Israelis and Palestinians, but between Israel and parts of the Arab world. In 2020, a series of normalization agreements were signed between Israel and several Arab states, later known collectively as the Abraham Accords. These agreements marked a significant departure from decades of regional consensus that normalized relations with Israel would follow, not precede, resolution of the Palestinian question. For Israel, the accords represented strategic success. They offered diplomatic recognition, economic partnerships, and a sense of regional integration long sought but rarely achieved. Flights were established. Trade agreements followed. Public language shifted from isolation toward acceptance, at least among certain governments. For Palestinians, the moment landed very differently. Many viewed the accords as abandonment. The belief that Arab solidarity would provide leverage in negotiations with Israel weakened further. The Palestinian issue, long framed as central to regional politics, appeared increasingly sidelined by shifting alliances and shared security concerns. This realignment reshaped expectations. If normalization could proceed without Palestinian statehood, then the incentives for compromise seemed diminished. The sense that time favored occupation rather than resolution deepened among Palestinians, reinforcing despair and anger in equal measure. At the same time, conditions on the ground continued to evolve. Settlement expansion in the West Bank accelerated, often driven by ideological movements and supported by political currents within Israel. Outposts became neighborhoods. Temporary structures became permanent. Legal distinctions blurred as infrastructure connected settlements more tightly to Israel proper. For Palestinians, daily geography grew more fragmented. Road networks prioritized settler access. Military protection expanded around Israeli communities. Palestinian villages faced increasing restrictions on construction and movement. Encounters between settlers and Palestinians became more frequent and more volatile. Violence simmered. Attacks by individuals, clashes during raids, and settler vigilantism created a constant undercurrent of tension. While not always front-page news, these incidents shaped daily life profoundly, reinforcing fear and mistrust. In Gaza, the cycle of escalation continued. In 2021, a new round of intense fighting erupted, triggered by events in Jerusalem and spreading rapidly across borders. Rocket fire and airstrikes dominated headlines. Civilians on both sides endured nights of fear and loss. As before, a ceasefire eventually halted the violence without resolving its causes. For many, the repetition was numbing. Each escalation followed a familiar script. Triggers accumulated. Violence surged. International calls for restraint followed. Aid was pledged. Reconstruction began slowly. Then attention drifted, leaving the underlying conditions intact. Jerusalem remained a focal point. Tensions around housing, residency rights, and access to holy sites intensified. Policing decisions and political gestures reverberated far beyond the city itself. The symbolic weight of Jerusalem meant that even small changes carried enormous emotional force. Within Israel, political life grew increasingly turbulent. Repeated elections reflected deep divisions within society. Debates over identity, governance, and the balance between democracy and nationalism intensified. Questions once framed around security and peace expanded to include the nature of the state itself. In 2023, widespread protests erupted over proposed judicial reforms. Hundreds of thousands of Israelis took to the streets, expressing concern about the erosion of democratic norms and institutional checks. The protests revealed fractures not only between political camps, but within families, workplaces, and communities. The conflict, once seen primarily as external, now intersected more visibly with internal struggles. For Palestinians, these developments were watched with a mix of hope and skepticism. Some saw potential openings in Israeli dissent. Others doubted that internal Israeli debates would translate into meaningful change for those living under occupation. Meanwhile, Palestinian politics remained deeply divided. Leadership legitimacy continued to erode. Elections were postponed indefinitely. Governance in Gaza and the West Bank followed divergent paths, often prioritizing survival over vision. Young Palestinians expressed growing disillusionment, not only with Israel, but with their own political structures. New forms of resistance emerged. Rather than centralized movements, smaller, localized groups appeared, particularly in the northern West Bank. These groups operated outside traditional party frameworks, driven by anger, despair, and a sense of abandonment. Their actions reflected both fragmentation and intensity, a conflict no longer neatly contained within familiar categories. International responses struggled to adapt. Traditional diplomatic frameworks felt increasingly disconnected from realities on the ground. The two-state solution remained the official goal of many governments, yet conditions necessary to achieve it continued to erode. Statements reaffirmed commitment, even as confidence in feasibility waned. Global attention shifted repeatedly. Crises elsewhere drew focus away. When the Israeli-Palestinian conflict resurfaced, it often did so through brief bursts of coverage tied to violence, rather than sustained engagement with underlying causes. Within both societies, memory continued to shape perception. Israelis carried the legacy of vulnerability, reinforced by each attack and escalation. Palestinians carried the legacy of dispossession and stagnation, reinforced by each new restriction or settlement. These memories were not static. They evolved, passed down through stories, media, and education, shaping how new generations interpreted events. The language used to describe the conflict shifted subtly. Peace became a distant aspiration rather than an imminent goal. Stability replaced resolution as a benchmark of success. Management replaced reconciliation. The idea of ending the conflict gave way to the idea of living with it. Yet living with unresolved history comes at a cost. Trauma does not dissipate simply because it becomes familiar. Inequality does not soften because it persists. Over time, the gap between official narratives and lived experience widened, creating fertile ground for sudden rupture. By the early 2020s, the conflict felt simultaneously entrenched and unstable. Entrenched in its structures. Unstable in its potential to ignite unexpectedly. Calm periods carried an undertone of fragility, as if something unseen were pressing upward, waiting for the right conditions. Part 12 comes to rest here, in this uneasy equilibrium. The surface appears steady, shaped by agreements, barriers, and routines. Beneath it, unresolved questions churn quietly. Alliances shift. Identities strain. The past continues to assert itself, not through grand declarations, but through accumulated pressure. As we move gently onward, we will step into the moment when this pressure finally breaks through, reminding the world that conflicts left unresolved do not fade. They resurface, often with renewed force, demanding to be seen once more. Part 13, when the ground gave way. Long periods of stillness can create the illusion of balance. For years, the conflict had been managed through containment, deterrence, and routine escalation. Each side learned the rhythms of the other. Lines were crossed, then redrawn. Violence flared, then subsided. The language of policy emphasized stability over solution, calm over justice. Many believed the system, however flawed, could hold. Then, in the early hours of October 2023, the ground gave way. An unprecedented assault was launched from Gaza into southern Israel. Armed militants crossed borders long treated as sealed. Communities that had lived for years under the shadow of rockets now faced direct invasion. Homes were entered. Civilians were killed. Others were taken captive. The scale and intimacy of the violence shattered assumptions that separation alone could guarantee safety. For Israel, the shock was profound. The attack pierced not only physical defenses, but psychological ones. The belief that technology, intelligence, and deterrence had created a reliable shield collapsed in a matter of hours. Sirens were no longer distant warnings. they were overtaken by sounds of gunfire and chaos. Communities built around agriculture, family, and quiet routine became sites of trauma. Survivors spoke of confusion, disbelief, and loss unfolding faster than comprehension. The state, long defined by readiness, appeared momentarily unprepared. National grief arrived alongside fury. Public mourning blended with a demand for decisive response. Questions about failure circulated immediately, but were overshadowed by a sense that something fundamental had been violated. The attack was framed not as escalation, but as rupture. Israel's response followed swiftly and overwhelmingly. Military operations against Gaza intensified to a scale unseen in years. Airstrikes targeted infrastructure, command centers, and dense urban areas. A ground campaign followed. The stated objectives focused on dismantling militant capacity and securing the return of captives. The language of deterrence gave way to the language of elimination. For Gaza's population, the consequences were catastrophic. Already constrained by blockade and repeated conflict, the territory absorbed devastation on a massive scale. Neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. Hospitals struggled under impossible conditions. Electricity, water, and medical supplies became scarce. Displacement surged as civilians fled bombardment, often with nowhere safe to go. The human cost mounted rapidly. Families were fractured. Children were buried. Survivors navigated loss amid continued danger. The distinction between combatant and civilian blurred in the lived experience of those trapped inside a war zone. Grief accumulated alongside fear and exhaustion. International attention surged, but consensus did not. Images of suffering spread globally, igniting protests, debates, and diplomatic strain. Governments struggled to balance condemnation, support, and calls for restraint. The conflict, long present in global consciousness, re-entered it with renewed intensity and polarization. Language hardened. Words like terror, genocide, self-defense, and collective punishment circulated widely, often without shared definition. Each side spoke from within its own trauma, its own moral framework. Dialogue gave way to accusation. Empathy narrowed under the weight of grief. Within Israel, unity and fracture existed simultaneously. A sense of collective mourning and resolve drew many together. At the same time, anger toward leadership intensified. Questions about intelligence failures, preparedness, and long-term strategy returned with urgency. The tension between survival and accountability grew sharper with each passing week. For Palestinians, despair deepened further. The sense of abandonment that had accumulated over decades now collided with immediate catastrophe. Many felt trapped not only by borders, but by narratives that rendered their suffering invisible or secondary. The future, already constrained, seemed to collapse inward. The regional impact rippled outward. Borders tightened. Militias elsewhere signaled readiness. Diplomatic channels worked to prevent wider war, even as rhetoric escalated. The fear of regional conflagration hovered constantly, shaping decisions and restraint. Yet amid the intensity, older patterns re-emerged. Ceasefire discussions surfaced intermittently. Humanitarian corridors were proposed and contested. Aid trickled in under restriction. Each pause in fighting carried hope and skepticism in equal measure. The deeper questions, once again, remained unresolved. What future could emerge from devastation led upon decades of unresolved conflict? Could security be achieved without political horizon? Could justice be pursued without acknowledgement of mutual humanity? For many observers, the events of October 2023 shattered the belief that the conflict could remain frozen indefinitely. The idea of management without resolution was exposed as fragile. Pain that had been contained erupted outward, demanding attention in its most brutal form. Memory reshaped itself rapidly. For Israelis, the attack joined a lineage of collective trauma, reinforcing narratives of vulnerability and existential threat. For Palestinians, the destruction intensified the sense of enduring catastrophe, led upon displacement and occupation. These memories would not fade quickly. They would enter classrooms, families, and political discourse, shaping how the next generation understood the past and imagined the future. Trauma would become inheritance once more. The world responded unevenly. Some called urgently for ceasefire and political renewal. Others emphasized security imperatives and deterrence. Aid organizations warned of collapse. Diplomats issued statements carefully calibrated, often lagging behind events on the ground. As weeks passed, the initial shock settled into a grim rhythm. Airstrikes continued. Ground operations advanced and stalled. Civilians remained trapped in cycles of fear. Captives remained in uncertainty. The scale of suffering challenged the capacity of language to contain it. In this moment, the foundations laid decades earlier were unmistakably present. The absence of resolution after 1948. The expansion of control after 1967. The failure of Oslo. The logic of separation. The long years of waiting. Each layer contributed to the conditions that made such rupture possible. Part 13 comes to rest here, amid devastation and reckoning. The ground has given way, exposing fault lines long ignored. What was managed has broken open. The conflict can no longer be described as distant, contained, or dormant. As we move gently onward, we will explore how societies attempt to make meaning from catastrophe, how narratives harden or shift in its aftermath, and how the choices made in the shadow of such loss will shape whatever future remains possible. Part 14, After the Breaking. After the ground gives way, there is a moment of disorientation. It arrives quietly, not during the loudest explosions or the most crowded headlines, but afterward, when the mind tries to place what has happened into some recognizable order. In the weeks following the rupture of October 2023, this disorientation settled over the region like dust, coating daily life with a sense that something fundamental had shifted, even if its final shape was still unclear. For Israel, the immediate period after the initial shock was defined by urgency and consolidation. Emergency governance took hold. Military decision-making moved to the center of political life. The language of unity was invoked often, emphasizing collective survival and resolve. At the same time, questions about failure did not disappear. They were simply postponed, set aside in the name of necessity, waiting for a moment when reflection could coexist with action. Families of those killed or taken captive lived inside a different rhythm of time. Days were measured by updates, rumors, and fragments of information. Posters bearing faces and names appeared in public spaces, transforming streets into quiet memorials and pleas for return. The absence of certainty became its own form of suffering, stretching grief into an open-ended state. In Gaza, the aftermath was immediate and relentless. The scale of destruction reshaped the physical and emotional landscape. Entire neighborhoods vanished into gray fields of debris. Familiar routes disappeared. Landmarks were erased. For many, orientation itself became difficult. Streets no longer led where memory expected them to go. Humanitarian needs surged beyond capacity. Hospitals operated under constant strain. Medical staff worked with dwindling supplies. Families crowded into shelters, often moving repeatedly as fighting shifted. The search for safety became continuous, exhausting, and uncertain. The concept of refuge felt increasingly abstract. The international community responded with intensity, but not with unity. Emergency sessions convened. Statements were issued. Aid pledges were announced. Yet consensus proved elusive. Competing narratives shaped diplomatic language, each emphasizing different moral priorities and legal interpretations. Calls for ceasefire clashed with assertions of self-defense. Appeals to humanitarian law collided with fears of renewed attacks. For many observers, this discord felt familiar. The conflict had long resisted simple framing. Each attempt to impose clarity often revealed deeper contradiction. In moments of extreme violence, these contradictions sharpened rather than softened. Across the West Bank, tension rose steadily. Protests erupted in cities and villages, fueled by anger, grief, and fear that the violence would spread further. Israeli military operations intensified in response, targeting militant networks but affecting civilian life broadly. Raids, arrests, and clashes became more frequent. The sense of instability deepened. Palestinian communities in the West Bank lived with layered anxiety. They watched Gaza's devastation while navigating their own precarious reality. The fear of escalation coexisted with frustration toward leadership that seemed unable to protect or represent them effectively. Political paralysis felt heavier under the weight of collective trauma. Within Israeli society, the sense of vulnerability returned forcefully. The belief that borders and barriers alone could ensure safety had been shattered. Even as military operations progressed, an undercurrent of unease persisted. What did security mean now, after the failure of assumptions so carefully built over years? Public discourse reflected this tension. Some voices demanded overwhelming force, arguing that deterrence must be restored at any cost. Others questioned whether force alone could ever provide lasting safety, pointing to decades of unresolved conflict as evidence of its limits. These debates unfolded amid mourning, making them both urgent and painful. International media coverage intensified polarization. Images circulated widely, often stripped of context or layered meaning. Suffering was measured, compared, and debated. Social platforms amplified outrage and solidarity, but also deepened division. Language hardened. Empathy narrowed. For many individuals far from the region, the conflict became a moral litmus test. Complex histories were compressed into slogans. Nuance was treated with suspicion. The demand to choose a side overshadowed the need to understand how such suffering had come to feel inevitable. Inside the region, daily life continued under extraordinary strain. In Israel, schools reopened sporadically. Work resumed unevenly. Sirens interrupted routine without warning. In Gaza, routine itself collapsed, replaced by survival. In the West Bank, movement grew more restricted, work more uncertain, nights more tense. Time felt distorted everywhere. Moments of quiet carried the weight of anticipation, as if violence might return at any second. The future shrank into the immediate present, leaving little room for long-term imagination. Yet even in this heaviness, patterns began to emerge. Diplomatic efforts sought limited pauses in fighting, framed as humanitarian necessities rather than political breakthroughs. Aid corridors opened briefly, then closed. Each pause was fragile, negotiated under pressure, and burdened with suspicion. These pauses revealed both possibility and fragility. They showed that restraint could be negotiated, but also how easily it could unravel. Trust was thin. Every action was interpreted through fear of exploitation or betrayal. The deeper political questions remained untouched. What would happen after the fighting slowed? Who would govern Gaza? How could security be maintained without perpetuating enclosure and despair? What future existed for Palestinians beyond survival? What future existed for Israelis beyond constant readiness? These questions hovered, unaddressed, shaping decisions indirectly. For Palestinians, the sense of historical continuity deepened. The events of 2023 were absorbed into a longer narrative of loss and displacement. Older generations recognized familiar patterns of devastation. Younger ones experienced trauma that would shape identity and memory for decades. The language of catastrophe regained prominence, not as metaphor, but as lived reality. For Israelis, the rupture joined a lineage of national trauma. The sense of existential threat intensified. The belief in self-reliance hardened. Trust in external guarantees weakened further. Security was framed not as policy preference, but as moral imperative. Both societies found themselves pulled inward by fear. This inward turn made empathy harder, even as suffering on both sides grew more visible. Grief narrowed perspective. Pain demanded priority. The possibility of shared humanity receded under the pressure of survival. And yet, beneath the noise, quieter moments persisted. Candlelight vigils appeared in unexpected places. Aid workers crossed lines of danger to help strangers. Families on both sides mourned privately, away from cameras and slogans. These moments did not resolve the conflict, but they resisted total dehumanization. They reminded some that catastrophe does not erase complexity. As weeks turned into months, the immediate shock softened into grim awareness. The conflict had entered a new phase, not entirely new, but newly exposed. The structures that had managed tension for years were clearly insufficient. The cost of postponement had become undeniable. What came next remained uncertain. Would the aftermath lead to renewed entrenchment, with separation enforced more rigidly than before? Or would the scale of devastation force a reimagining of political possibilities long avoided? Would trauma harden identities beyond repair, or eventually compel reckoning? No answers arrived quickly. History, after such breaking, does not move in straight lines. It circles, hesitates, tests, and retreats. Decisions made in moments of fear echo far longer than those made in calm. Part 14 comes to rest here, in the long aftermath. The breaking has passed, but its effects continue to unfold quietly and relentlessly. Lives are being reshaped in ways that will only become fully visible with time. Memory is being rewritten even as events continue. As we move gently onward, we will look at how societies attempt to carry trauma forward, how narratives solidify or fracture, and how the choices made in the shadow of catastrophe may determine whether the future repeats the past or finally begins to loosen its grip. Part 15. Carrying what remains. After catastrophe, life does not pause to ask permission to continue. It resumes unevenly, shaped by what has been lost and what must still be done. In the wake of the violence that reshaped the region, both Israeli and Palestinian societies found themselves carrying not only physical destruction, but emotional weight that resisted easy expression. Trauma became part of daily atmosphere, influencing decisions, relationships, and the stories people told themselves about the future. For many Israelis, the months that followed were marked by a constant oscillation between grief and vigilance. Memorials appeared across cities and towns, spontaneous at first, then formalized. Names were spoken repeatedly, as if repetition might anchor loss into something comprehensible. The presence of absence became visible everywhere, in empty chairs, unfinished conversations, and routines that no longer fit. At the same time, daily life resumed. Children returned to school under heightened security. Workplaces reopened with quieter hallways. Public gatherings felt different, edged with caution. The sense that safety could be assumed had been replaced by a more fragile understanding of normalcy, one that required constant reinforcement. Public debate intensified. Questions that had once simmered beneath the surface now demanded attention. How had the assumptions of deterrence failed so completely? What responsibility did leadership bear? Could the structures that govern security and intelligence be trusted again? These questions were asked not only in political arenas, but around dinner tables and in private conversations. Yet even as accountability was discussed, fear constrained imagination. Many Israelis felt that any deviation from maximal security risked repetition of catastrophe. The horizon of acceptable solutions narrowed further. Ideas that once belonged to the realm of possibility were now viewed through the lens of immediate survival. For Palestinians, particularly in Gaza, the act of carrying on took a more elemental form. Survival itself became labor. Families navigated ruins where homes had once stood. Displacement lingered long after fighting subsided, as reconstruction proved slow and uncertain. Aid arrived unevenly, often insufficient for the scale of need. The physical environment mirrored emotional reality. Rubble fields stretched across neighborhoods, erasing landmarks that anchored memory. Children played among debris, their games shaped by absence. Adults spoke of before and after as distinct eras, separated by a rupture that felt permanent. Grief in Gaza was communal and relentless. Loss was not an isolated event, but an accumulation. Funerals followed one another closely. Names were added to lists already too long. The process of mourning overlapped with the demands of survival, leaving little space for reflection or recovery. In the West Bank, the experience was different, but no less heavy. Life continued under heightened tension. Raids increased. Movement grew more restricted. Violence flared unpredictably. Communities lived with the awareness that the line between relative calm and sudden upheaval was thin. Young Palestinians in particular felt suspended. They inherited decades of unresolved struggle, now intensified by recent devastation. Many expressed anger not only toward Israel, but toward their own leadership, which appeared distant and ineffective. The sense of political stagnation deepened, fueling frustration and despair in equal measure. Across both societies, trauma shaped narrative. Stories were told to make sense of loss, to justify fear, to preserve dignity. These stories often hardened into certainties. For Israelis, the narrative emphasized vulnerability and the necessity of strength. For Palestinians, it emphasized injustice and endurance in the face of overwhelming power. These narratives were not fabricated. They were rooted in lived experience. Yet as they solidified, they left little room for acknowledging the suffering of the other. Pain demanded centrality, and there was limited space for competing truths. International responses reflected this polarization. Debates in global forums became more charged, less patient with complexity. Words like ceasefire, security, occupation, and resistance were invoked repeatedly, often stripped of nuance. The conflict became a mirror for broader anxieties about power, morality, and identity in a fractured world. The role of the United Nations remained contested. Resolutions were proposed. Investigations were debated. Aid mechanisms were activated. Yet the gap between international language and local reality felt wide. For those living through the aftermath, global concern often arrived as distant noise rather than tangible change. Memory began to shift subtly. As immediate shock softened, longer narratives reasserted themselves. Israelis linked recent trauma to earlier moments of existential threat, reinforcing a sense of historical continuity marked by survival against odds. Palestinians folded new loss into an older story of displacement and denial, extending a timeline of catastrophe that seemed unbroken. This layering of memory mattered. It shaped how events were taught, discussed, and remembered. It influenced which futures felt imaginable and which felt dangerous. Memory became not only a record of the past, but a guide for expectation. In quieter moments, however, cracks appeared in hardened perspectives. Some Israelis questioned whether permanent dominance could ever provide true safety. Some Palestinians questioned whether perpetual resistance without political horizon could ever deliver dignity. These questions were not yet dominant, but they existed, often expressed privately rather than publicly. Civil society efforts persisted despite pressure. Humanitarian workers crossed boundaries to provide aid. Mental health professionals addressed trauma where resources allowed. Small groups of Israelis and Palestinians continued dialogue, even as broader society moved toward separation and suspicion. These efforts were fragile, often criticized, but they endured. The land itself offered a different kind of testimony. Fields were replanted. Olive trees sprouted new growth even where older trunks had been damaged. Daily cycles of light and weather continued indifferent to human conflict. For some, this continuity offered comfort. For others, it underscored the tragedy of repeated destruction imposed upon something that could otherwise sustain life. Time moved unevenly. Moments of relative calm alternated with renewed tension. Headlines shifted focus, then returned. For those directly affected, the conflict never fully receded. It shaped how people slept, planned, and imagined what might come next. The question of what remained became central. What remained after loss, after failure, after devastation? What values could be carried forward without reproducing the conditions that led to catastrophe? What responsibilities did the present hold toward the future? These questions did not yet yield answers. They lingered in classrooms, in memorial spaces, in the silence after arguments ended without resolution. They lingered in the choices made by individuals navigating constrained realities, deciding how much hope to allow themselves. Part 15 comes to rest here, in this act of carrying. The conflict is no longer only about territory or treaties. It is about memory, trauma, and the weight of inherited pain. It is about how societies choose to live with what remains after the ground has given way. As we move gently onward, we will explore how these carried burdens shape political possibility, how fear and grief influence decision-making, and whether spaces still exist, however small, for imagining a future not entirely defined by loss. Part 16. The narrowing of possibility. When grief settles into routine, it begins to shape what feels possible. After months of carrying loss, fear, and uncertainty, both Israeli and Palestinian societies found their political horizons narrowing. Not because imagination had vanished entirely, but because imagination itself felt risky. To imagine differently was to risk being wrong again, to risk vulnerability in a world that had just proven how costly vulnerability could be. In Israel, security thinking moved from priority to premise. It was no longer one consideration among many. It became the frame through which all others were evaluated. Economic policy, diplomacy, infrastructure, and even cultural life were filtered through the question of safety. The assumption that threat was constant settled deeply into public consciousness. This did not occur through decree alone. It happened through repetition. Through sirens interrupting ordinary moments. Through the retelling of stories of loss. Through images replayed until they fused into collective memory. Over time, caution hardened into expectation. Expectation hardened into worldview. Within this worldview, political possibility narrowed. Proposals once discussed openly became politically untenable. Withdrawal sounded like exposure. Compromise sounded like weakness. Negotiation sounded naive. Even those who privately questioned this trajectory often hesitated to voice alternatives, aware of how quickly doubt could be framed as disloyalty or denial of pain. For Palestinians, the narrowing felt different, but no less constricting. In Gaza, the future was reduced to survival. Conversations about long-term politics felt detached from daily reality. People spoke instead of food, shelter, and the next safe moment. Political language lost resonance when basic needs were unmet. In the West Bank, the narrowing took the form of fragmentation. Movement restrictions, settlement expansion, and periodic violence shrank the spaces in which ordinary life could unfold. Economic opportunity remained constrained. Political participation felt increasingly symbolic rather than transformative. The sense that individual choices could meaningfully alter collective outcomes weakened. Young Palestinians often articulated this as suffocation. They described feeling boxed in by history they did not choose and leadership they did not trust. Some turned toward localized resistance. Others withdrew into private worlds, focusing on family, work, or migration dreams that carried their own risks and losses. Across both societies, fatigue reshaped engagement. People still cared deeply, but their energy for sustained political struggle waned. Protests rose and fell. Petitions circulated. Statements were issued. Yet the sense that action could lead to resolution felt distant. This fatigue did not mean indifference. It meant that pain had become familiar enough to be endured, but not familiar enough to be resolved. The conflict lived on not only through violence, but through resignation. International actors struggled to respond meaningfully to this narrowed terrain. Diplomatic initiatives were proposed cautiously, often framed as confidence-building rather than transformative. The language of peace was replaced by the language of de-escalation. Preventing things from getting worse became the ceiling of ambition. Meetings were held in neutral rooms. Tables were set. Papers were drafted. Carefully chosen words were exchanged. Yet these encounters often felt disconnected from the realities outside conference walls. The gap between policy language and lived experience widened further. The official commitment to a two-state solution persisted in statements. But on the ground, the conditions necessary to realize it continued to erode. Territory was increasingly fragmented. Political authority was divided. Trust was scarce. Time itself seemed to work against resolution rather than toward it. This contradiction produced a strange quiet. Not the quiet of peace, but the quiet of lowered expectation. When no breakthrough is anticipated, disappointment loses its edge. Hope recedes, replaced by pragmatism shaped by constraint. Within Israel, this pragmatism expressed itself as management. The conflict was approached as something to be contained indefinitely. Periodic violence was treated as disruption rather than symptom. The goal became restoring calm quickly, not addressing underlying causes. Calm was measured statistically, by reduced attacks, rather than experientially, by dignity or freedom. Within Palestinian society, pragmatism took the form of endurance. People adapted to restriction with ingenuity and resilience. Informal economies flourished where formal ones failed. Social networks compensated for institutional weakness. Humor, art, and memory carried meaning where politics offered little. Yet endurance carried a cost. When survival becomes the primary goal, long-term vision fades. Political imagination withers. The ability to articulate a future beyond resistance or containment weakens. Jerusalem remained a mirror of this narrowing. The city was described officially as unified, yet lived as layered and unequal. Administrative decisions accumulated quietly, reshaping neighborhoods and access. Each small change felt permanent, irreversible, even when presented as temporary or technical. Tension flared periodically, then subsided. Each flare reinforced the sense that calm was fragile and conditional. Residents learned to read subtle signs, adjusting behavior to avoid confrontation. The city functioned, but under constant negotiation between law, power, and presence. Memory played an increasingly active role. In Israel, recent trauma reinforced older narratives of existential threat, linking past and present into a single arc of vulnerability. In Palestinian communities, new loss layered onto older memories of displacement, reinforcing the sense of a future perpetually deferred. These memories did not simply coexist. They competed. Each demanded recognition. Each sought moral centrality. In this competition, space for shared narrative shrank further. Education reflected this divergence. Children learned histories that emphasized their community's suffering and resilience. Rarely did they encounter the other's story except as background or threat. By the time they reached adulthood, many had internalized narratives that felt self-evident and complete. The narrowing of possibility thus became generational. It was passed not only through policy, but through story, habit, and expectation. It shaped what questions were asked and which were left unspoken. And yet, even within narrowed spaces, small openings persisted. Some Israelis continued to question whether permanent dominance could deliver lasting safety. Some Palestinians continued to imagine dignity beyond survival. These thoughts surfaced in art, literature, and quiet conversation rather than formal politics. Civil initiatives endured. Dialogue groups met discreetly. Joint humanitarian efforts crossed boundaries during moments of crisis. These acts did not alter policy, but they resisted total separation. They suggested that possibility, while narrowed, was not extinguished. The challenge lay in scale. Small gestures struggled to influence large structures. Individual empathy faced institutional inertia. The weight of history pressed downward, making upward movement slow and uncertain. By this stage, the conflict was no longer defined primarily by negotiation or war. It was defined by management and endurance, by systems that reduced risk without offering resolution, by lives adapted to constraint rather than transformed by opportunity. This did not mean that the future was fixed. History rarely remains static indefinitely. Pressure accumulates. Assumptions are tested. The narrowing of possibility can itself become unsustainable. But in the present moment, that future felt distant. People lived inside narrowed spaces, making careful choices, carrying what they could, avoiding what they feared. The conflict shaped not only borders and policies, but the inner landscapes of those who lived within it. Part 16 comes to rest here, in this constricted terrain. Possibility has not vanished, but it has narrowed, shaped by trauma, fatigue, and habit. The challenge that lies ahead is not only political, but psychological, whether societies shaped by fear and endurance can widen their vision again without first being forced by yet another rupture. As we move gently onward, we will explore how history sometimes reopens what feels closed, how unexpected shifts can widen horizons again, and whether the narrowing of possibility is a final condition or a phase that precedes another transformation. Part 17, where cracks let light in. Even in the most rigid structures, stress creates fractures. They may be thin, nearly invisible at first, but they exist. And through them, something unexpected can enter. After long years defined by narrowing possibility, by management rather than imagination, small openings began to appear, not as grand political shifts, but as human responses to exhaustion. These openings did not announce themselves as solutions. They emerged quietly, often at the margins, where formal power was weakest and lived experience strongest. They appeared in classrooms, hospitals, neighborhoods, and online spaces. They were uneven, fragile, and frequently contested, yet they carried a different energy than what had come before. Among younger generations on both sides, a subtle change began to take shape. For many Israelis born after the Oslo years, the conflict had never been a story of negotiation or hope. It was a constant background condition. Walls existed. Checkpoints existed. Gaza was sealed. This reality felt permanent, but it also felt inherited rather than chosen. Some began to question that inheritance. Not always publicly, and not always safely, but persistently. They asked whether security without horizon was truly security. Whether control without resolution could ever bring rest. These questions did not dominate public discourse, but they circulated quietly, often in private spaces where fear of social consequence was lower. Among Palestinians, particularly the young, a parallel questioning unfolded. Decades of stalled leadership and fractured governance had eroded trust in traditional political paths. Many no longer believed that formal negotiations, as previously structured, would deliver dignity or freedom. At the same time, the cost of perpetual violence felt unbearable. This produced a search, not always articulated, for alternatives. Some turned toward global solidarity movements, framing their struggle through the language of human rights rather than nationalism alone. Others focused on local resilience, building community networks that prioritized survival, education, and mental health over grand political slogans. These shifts did not align neatly with existing factions. They cut across ideological lines, frustrating leaders who relied on older frameworks of loyalty and opposition. The result was not unity, but diversification. The conflict was no longer expressed through a single dominant narrative within each society. Civil society became a site of quiet experimentation. Joint initiatives, often small and underfunded, continued to operate despite hostility from hardliners. Israeli and Palestinian doctors collaborated in emergency care. Educators developed shared curricula in limited settings. Artists created work that held multiple truths at once, resisting the demand to simplify. These efforts did not change policy, but they changed perception for those involved. They introduced lived contradiction into narratives that thrived on absolutes. They made it harder to believe that the other side was only an abstraction or a threat. Humanitarian crises accelerated this process in unexpected ways. Moments of acute suffering, particularly in Gaza, prompted spontaneous acts of aid that crossed political boundaries. Some Israelis organized support through international channels. Some Palestinians acknowledged these efforts despite deep mistrust. These gestures were rare and often overshadowed by violence, but they mattered to those who witnessed them. They suggested that empathy had not disappeared. It had been suppressed, constrained by fear and grievance, but not extinguished. In moments when survival overwhelmed ideology, shared humanity resurfaced briefly, then retreated again under pressure. Digital spaces amplified both division and connection. Social platforms spread graphic images and hardened rhetoric, but they also allowed voices previously marginalized to reach broader audiences. Personal testimony circulated alongside official statements. Stories of loss, when told directly, sometimes pierced defenses built by abstraction. This exposure carried risk. Public empathy was often punished socially. Those who acknowledged the suffering of the other were accused of betrayal or moral confusion. Silence felt safer than complexity. Yet some persisted, accepting social cost in exchange for honesty. Within Israel, internal debates expanded beyond security alone. Concerns about democracy, civil rights, and governance intersected with questions of occupation and control. Some began to link internal inequality with external dominance, arguing that systems of power did not remain neatly separated. This framing did not dominate, but it lingered, unsettling comfortable distinctions. Within Palestinian society, conversations about accountability grew louder. Frustration with leadership stagnation turned into demands for reform, transparency, and representation. These demands were often suppressed or deferred, but they did not disappear. They circulated in families, universities, and online forums, shaping expectations quietly. The conflict, long framed as binary, began to feel crowded. Multiple narratives competed for attention within each society. Certainty weakened. This did not mean consensus emerged. It meant that the old clarity of opposition blurred slightly, creating discomfort alongside possibility. History often moves this way. Not through decisive turning points, but through accumulation of small doubts that eventually destabilize fixed assumptions. These doubts do not guarantee change. They only create conditions in which change becomes imaginable again. International dynamics added further complexity. Global conversations about colonialism, power, and human rights influenced how the conflict was discussed abroad. These frameworks were embraced by some and rejected by others, but they shifted the language of engagement. The conflict was increasingly understood not only as a regional dispute, but as part of broader questions about inequality and self-determination. This reframing was contested fiercely. Yet even contestation signaled movement. It suggested that old frames were no longer sufficient to contain the conflict's meaning. On the ground, daily realities remained harsh. Checkpoints still regulated movement. Gaza remained enclosed. Violence still erupted. The cracks did not remove weight. They simply allowed glimpses of something beyond it. For those living inside the conflict, this ambiguity was exhausting. Hope felt dangerous. Cynicism felt safer. Yet neither offered rest. Many lived suspended between resignation and longing, carrying both without fully committing to either. Memory continued to shape perception. Trauma did not loosen its grip easily. Recent devastation reinforced older fears and grievances. Any attempt to imagine a shared future had to contend with fresh wounds still open and bleeding. And yet, imagination persisted. It appeared in art that refused single stories. In classrooms where teachers gently introduced complexity. In friendships that crossed boundaries despite pressure not to. These acts were not loud, but they endured. They suggested that possibility, once narrowed, could widen again, not all at once, but unevenly. The danger lay in fragility. Cracks can close as easily as they open. Fear can rush back in, sealing openings with renewed force. Violence can harden hearts overnight. The conditions that allow light to enter are unstable, dependent on restraint, patience, and courage that are often in short supply. Still, history shows that transformation rarely begins at the center of power. It begins at the edges, where certainty weakens and necessity demands creativity. It begins when people, exhausted by repetition, try something slightly different, even if they cannot yet name it as change. Part 17 comes to rest here, at the threshold of ambiguity. The conflict remains unresolved. Structures of control and resistance still dominate. Suffering has not receded. Yet within the narrowing, small cracks have formed, letting in light that does not erase the past, but challenges the assumption that the future must repeat it. As we move gently onward, we will explore whether these cracks can widen without another rupture, whether imagination can grow without catastrophe, and what it would take for societies shaped by endurance to risk something new. Part 18, Between What Is and What Might Be. There are moments in history when the present feels suspended between exhaustion and possibility. Not because clarity has arrived, but because repetition has become unbearable. In these moments, societies do not yet know what they are moving toward. They only know that what came before can no longer hold in the same way. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict, after decades of rupture led upon rupture, has entered such a space again. This space is not calm. It is tense, uncertain, and fragile. Violence still erupts. Trauma remains fresh. Structures of power and resistance continue to operate. Yet beneath this familiar surface, something subtle is shifting, not uniformly, not predictably, but persistently enough to be felt. One of the clearest signs of this shift is fatigue. Not apathy, but deep exhaustion with cycles that promise security or liberation yet deliver neither. For Israelis, the cost of perpetual readiness weighs heavily. Military service stretches across generations. Emergencies interrupt ordinary life repeatedly. The sense that strength alone can guarantee safety feels increasingly incomplete. For Palestinians, the exhaustion is existential. Decades of occupation, displacement, and political stagnation have narrowed the space for hope. The language of resistance remains powerful, but its outcomes feel distant. The cost of endurance is borne daily, often without visible progress. Survival itself becomes an act of resistance, but one that leaves little room for imagination. This shared exhaustion does not produce agreement. It produces questioning. Quiet, uneven, and often private questioning. people begin to ask not how to win, but how to live. Not how to defeat the other, but how to escape the trap of repetition. These questions surface differently across contexts. In Israel, some voices ask whether permanent control over another people is sustainable without eroding democratic values and social cohesion. They question whether security achieved through domination can ever feel complete, or whether it inevitably generates new threats. Among Palestinians, questions emerge about strategy and leadership. Whether fragmented governance can deliver dignity. Whether external validation without internal accountability can build a future worth inheriting. Whether a struggle defined only by opposition can sustain meaning over generations. These questions do not yet coalesce into policy. They remain scattered, often contradictory, sometimes suppressed. Yet their presence matters. They signal that the conflict is no longer experienced only as confrontation, but as a condition that shapes every aspect of life, including identity, morality, and imagination. In this context, the idea of transition re-enters conversation. Not transition as immediate resolution, but as movement away from total stagnation. Discussions emerge around interim arrangements, humanitarian frameworks, and new forms of governance. These discussions are cautious, often technical, and burdened with mistrust. Ceasefires are negotiated, broken, renegotiated. Each pause in fighting reveals both possibility and limitation. The possibility lies in the fact that restraint can still be achieved, even amid deep hostility. The limitation lies in how quickly violence returns when underlying issues remain unaddressed. Reconstruction efforts illustrate this tension clearly. In Gaza, rebuilding is necessary and urgent. Homes, schools, and hospitals must be restored. Yet reconstruction without political horizon risks becoming repetition. Buildings rise only to be destroyed again. Aid alleviates suffering without altering conditions that produce it. For those living through it, reconstruction becomes both hope and reminder. Hope that life might regain some stability. Reminder that stability remains conditional, dependent on forces beyond local control. In the West Bank, incremental changes create similar ambiguity. Economic initiatives improve livelihoods in some areas, even as movement restrictions persist. Local governance functions unevenly, constrained by external authority and internal division. Daily life improves for some while remaining stagnant or deteriorating for others. This unevenness complicates narrative. It becomes harder to describe the conflict as uniformly frozen or uniformly exploding. Instead, it exists in layers, where improvement and deterioration occur simultaneously, often in close proximity. Education becomes a critical site of this tension. Classrooms carry the weight of inherited narratives while shaping future ones. Teachers navigate competing demands to preserve identity, to acknowledge trauma, and to prepare students for a world that may not change as promised. In some spaces, educators experiment cautiously with complexity, introducing multiple perspectives without forcing reconciliation. These efforts are quiet and vulnerable. They risk backlash from communities that fear dilution of truth or betrayal of memory. Yet they persist, driven by the recognition that narratives alone cannot sustain societies indefinitely. In Israel, debates about the future increasingly intersect with internal questions of governance and identity. The balance between security and democracy, between majority rule and minority rights, between historical memory and present responsibility, becomes harder to avoid. The conflict is no longer external to these debates. It is woven into them. Among Palestinians, discussions about representation and legitimacy grow more urgent. Younger generations demand voice. They question leaders who speak in their name without accountability. They seek frameworks that address not only national aspirations, but everyday dignity, economic opportunity, and personal freedom. These demands challenge existing power structures. They are often met with resistance, delay, or suppression. Yet they do not disappear. They circulate through social networks, cultural expression, and informal organizing, shaping expectations even when they do not reshape institutions. International actors watch this terrain cautiously. Past interventions have left scars. Promises unfulfilled have eroded credibility. New initiatives are framed carefully, emphasizing pragmatism over idealism. The language of right competes with the language of stability. The result is often incrementalism that struggles to match the scale of suffering. Still, moments arise when external pressure aligns with internal questioning. Humanitarian crises force engagement. Regional shifts alter incentives. Global conversations about inequality and justice influence how the conflict is understood and discussed. These forces do not determine outcomes, but they create openings that did not exist before. The risk, always, is backlash. Periods of questioning can provoke fear among those who benefit from existing arrangements or who interpret uncertainty as threat. Violence can reassert itself as a way to restore clarity through force. Narratives can harden again, sealing cracks that had begun to open. History offers no guarantee that possibility will widen rather than close. Yet it also shows that stagnation is rarely permanent. Pressure accumulates. Assumptions erode. The present becomes untenable in ways that demand change, even if the shape of that change remains unclear. For individuals living inside the conflict, this ambiguity is deeply uncomfortable. Certainty, even painful certainty, can feel safer than open-ended possibility. Yet certainty has delivered decades of loss. This recognition, quiet but persistent, fuels the questioning that now circulates beneath the surface. Memory continues to exert its force. Recent trauma sharpens older wounds. Each side carries stories that feel non-negotiable. Any movement forward must contend with these memories, not erase them. The challenge is not forgetting, but integrating memory in ways that do not foreclose the future. In this space between what is and what might be, small choices matter. How language is used. How suffering is acknowledged. How restraint is valued. These choices do not resolve the conflict, but they influence whether transition remains imaginable. The conflict is not yet transforming. Structures of control remain. Violence remains possible. Political horizons remain constrained. Yet the present feels different from the years of pure management that came before. The illusion of permanence has been weakened by rupture and exhaustion. This weakening creates risk and opportunity simultaneously. Risk that fear will dominate and harden into new forms of entrenchment. Opportunity that questioning will widen into imagination, and imagination into change. Which path emerges cannot be predicted from this moment. History is shaped not only by leaders and institutions, but by cumulative choices made under pressure. By whether societies choose to respond to exhaustion with deeper control or with cautious openness. Part 18 comes to rest here, in this suspended space. The conflict stands between what it has been and what it could become. The weight of the past presses heavily, yet the future has not closed entirely. Possibility exists not as promise, but as question. As we move gently onward, we will explore how history sometimes tips from question into direction, how moments of suspension resolve into movement, and what conditions might allow this conflict, so long defined by repetition, to take a different shape without requiring another catastrophic break. Part 19: Choosing Direction Without Certainty. There comes a stage in long conflicts when the question is no longer whether change will happen, but how. Not because resolution is close, but because standing still has become its own form of collapse. In the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the accumulation of exhaustion, trauma, and contradiction has brought societies to this threshold repeatedly. What feels different now is not clarity of outcome, but awareness of cost. The cost of repetition is no longer abstract. It is measured in shortened lives, fractured families, eroded institutions, and futures narrowed before they begin. It is measured in the quiet normalization of emergency, in the way violence becomes expected rather than shocking. This awareness does not automatically produce agreement, but it alters the moral terrain on which decisions are made. In Israel, this awareness has begun to reshape conversation, even when policy lags behind. Security remains paramount, but its definition is under quiet scrutiny. Questions surface about whether perpetual military dominance can deliver the kind of safety that allows a society to rest, rather than merely endure. The distinction between survival and flourishing grows harder to ignore. Some voices argue that strength must now include restraint. Not as concession, but as strategy. They point to decades in which overwhelming force reduced immediate threat but reproduced long-term instability. They ask whether true security might require political horizon, even if that horizon feels distant and fraught. These arguments remain contested. Others insist that any loosening of control invites catastrophe, citing recent trauma as proof. The fear is real, grounded in lived experience. It shapes boundaries of debate sharply. Yet the presence of debate itself marks movement from the years when alternatives felt unthinkable. Among Palestinians, a parallel reckoning unfolds. The language of liberation remains powerful, but its pathways are under renewed examination. Armed struggle has brought attention and loss, but not freedom. Negotiation has brought recognition and disappointment, but not sovereignty. Many now ask what dignity looks like under conditions where neither strategy has delivered its promise. This questioning does not produce unity. It produces divergence. Some seek new forms of resistance rooted in civil pressure and global advocacy. Others prioritize local governance, education, and economic survival as foundations for future possibility. Still others, exhausted by politics altogether, focus on private life and emigration dreams. The fragmentation itself is instructive. It reveals that the conflict is no longer experienced solely as a national struggle, but as a condition shaping individual lives in deeply personal ways. Direction is no longer assumed to be singular. It is negotiated within families, communities, and conscience. This multiplicity complicates leadership. Traditional political frameworks struggle to contain these divergent impulses. Authority weakens when it cannot articulate a credible future. Demands for accountability grow louder, even when avenues for change remain blocked. International actors face their own reckoning. Past formulas feel insufficient. The repetition of familiar language without corresponding change has eroded trust. New proposals emphasize pragmatism, sequencing, and safeguards, yet they remain constrained by political realities on the ground. Still, moments arise when alignment seems possible. Humanitarian imperatives force cooperation, however temporary. Reconstruction efforts create spaces for coordination, even amid distrust. Ceasefires, though fragile, demonstrate that restraint can be negotiated when incentives align. These moments matter. They show that the conflict is not governed solely by inevitability. Choice still operates, even if within narrow margins. The challenge lies in expanding those margins without triggering backlash. The idea of interim direction gains traction in this context. Not final status solutions, but steps that alter trajectory. Measures that reduce harm, increase agency, and preserve future options. These include changes in movement access, governance arrangements, economic frameworks, and security coordination that prioritizes civilian protection. Such steps are often criticized as insufficient. They do not resolve core issues. They risk entrenching partial arrangements. Yet they can shift lived experience in ways that matter deeply to those affected. They can also test assumptions, revealing which fears are grounded and which are sustained by habit. Jerusalem remains central to these deliberations. Any direction chosen will touch the city, symbolically and practically. Its layered identities resist simplification. Decisions there resonate far beyond municipal boundaries, shaping perception of fairness and belonging across the region. Approaches that acknowledge multiplicity rather than impose singular control face resistance. Yet they also reflect reality more honestly. The city has never been simple. Attempts to make it so have consistently failed. Memory continues to exert pressure. Recent trauma sharpens caution. Older wounds reinforce suspicion. Any step forward must contend with the fear that compromise erases suffering. The task is not to diminish memory, but to prevent it from foreclosing the future entirely. Education plays a quiet but critical role here. How stories are told to the next generation matters profoundly. Whether history is framed as fixed destiny or contested inheritance shapes imagination. Some educators, working within constraint, introduce complexity cautiously, not to demand reconciliation, but to allow thought. These efforts are slow. Their impact is not immediately measurable. Yet they accumulate over time, influencing how young people understand agency, responsibility, and the possibility of coexistence without denying conflict. Economic considerations add another layer. Prosperity alone does not resolve political injustice, but deprivation intensifies grievance. Initiatives that improve livelihoods can create breathing room, reducing the immediacy of desperation. At the same time, economic improvement without political agency risks reinforcing dependency. Balancing these dynamics requires care. It demands that material progress be paired with expanded voice and dignity. This pairing has often been absent in past efforts, undermining their legitimacy. The role of regional dynamics cannot be ignored. Shifting alliances alter incentives. Normalization without resolution changes calculations on all sides. The Palestinian issue is no longer the sole axis of regional politics, but it remains a moral reference point that shapes legitimacy. This creates pressure and opportunity simultaneously. Pressure, because leverage has diminished. Opportunity, because new configurations may allow creative arrangements previously blocked by rigid alignments. The danger remains that direction will be chosen by default rather than design. That drift will solidify into new permanence, closing options further. History is filled with moments when failure to choose became a choice with lasting consequence. Avoiding this outcome requires intentionality under uncertainty. It requires acknowledging fear without allowing it to dominate. It requires holding memory without freezing into it. It requires recognizing that direction does not require certainty, only willingness to act with awareness of consequence. For individuals living inside the conflict, this is an intimate challenge. Choices are made daily about how much to engage, how much to withdraw, how much hope to allow. These choices shape collective atmosphere quietly, cumulatively. Small shifts matter. How language is used in public space. How suffering is acknowledged. How restraint is valued alongside strength. These signals influence whether imagination contracts or expands. The conflict stands at a point where repetition feels unbearable, but alternatives feel dangerous. This tension defines the present. It is not comfortable. It is not stable. Yet it is where history often turns, not through clarity, but through accumulated recognition that the cost of staying the same has grown too high. Direction will not emerge all at once. It will be shaped by partial steps, contested narratives, and uneven progress. It will involve missteps and backlash. Yet movement, even imperfect, differs from paralysis. Part 19 comes to rest here, in this moment of uneasy choosing. The future is not yet formed. The past weighs heavily. But the sense that direction must be chosen, rather than deferred, has begun to settle across the landscape. As we move gently onward into the final part, we will reflect on what it means to carry such a history forward, how societies live with unresolved origins, and whether the foundation laid so long ago can support something different than endless repetition, not through forgetting, but through deliberate, difficult change. Part 20. What foundations carry forward? Every foundation holds more than the moment it was laid. It carries the intentions, fears, compromises, and silences of those who built upon it. Over time, weight accumulates. Rooms are added. Cracks appear. Repairs are made or deferred. Eventually, the structure becomes not only a product of design, but of endurance. The foundation of the State of Israel was laid in urgency, shaped by survival, memory, and international decision. It emerged from catastrophe and hope intertwined, from longing for safety after centuries of vulnerability, and from a belief that sovereignty could provide what dispersion could not. That foundation succeeded in its most immediate aim. A state was created. A people secured political existence. Life continued. Yet foundations do not determine everything. They influence what is possible, what feels natural, and what feels forbidden. They shape movement more than destination. And when a foundation is laid in a landscape already inhabited by other histories, other attachments, other claims, its consequences extend far beyond those who laid it. For Palestinians, the same moment marked not safety gained, but home disrupted. Displacement, loss of land, and political marginalization became defining experiences. The absence of sovereignty shaped daily life, identity, and aspiration. What one people experienced as return, another experienced as rupture. These truths developed side by side, rarely meeting without friction. Over decades, both experiences hardened into memory. Memory shaped institutions, education, and language. It guided policy and justified fear. It provided coherence in the face of loss, but it also narrowed empathy. Each side learned to carry its own pain with precision, while struggling to recognize the pain of the other without feeling diminished. History layered these memories repeatedly. War in 1948. Occupation after 1967. Failed negotiations. Uprisings. Separation. Periodic devastation. Each layer reinforced the sense that the conflict was not an episode, but a condition. Something inherited rather than chosen. Something endured rather than resolved. And yet, endurance is not the same as destiny. Foundations can be reinforced, reshaped, or rebuilt. This does not mean erasing what came before. It means deciding what the structure will carry forward. The question that emerges now, after so much repetition, is not whether the past can be undone. It cannot. The question is whether the past must continue to dictate the future without alteration. For Israelis, the foundation has delivered safety and vulnerability at once. The state provided refuge and continuity. It also required constant defense, binding national identity tightly to security. The line between protection and fear blurred over time. Strength became essential, but rest remained elusive. Many Israelis now live with a quiet tension. The tension between pride in survival and weariness with conflict. Between belief in self-reliance and recognition that isolation carries its own risks. Between memory of catastrophe and desire for normal life. For Palestinians, the foundation laid elsewhere has defined absence. Absence of statehood. Absence of control. Absence of certainty. Yet within this absence, identity and resilience formed. Communities adapted. Culture endured. Memory was preserved as an act of resistance against erasure. Many Palestinians now live with a different tension. The tension between holding on and letting go. Between resistance and exhaustion. Between inherited struggle and the desire for ordinary dignity. Between loyalty to memory and the need for a livable future. These tensions do not resolve themselves through time alone. Time, without intention, often deepens grooves rather than smoothing them. It turns provisional measures into permanence. It normalizes emergency. It teaches people how to survive within limits rather than how to imagine beyond them. The last decades have shown this clearly. Management replaced resolution. Separation replaced reconciliation. Stability replaced justice. Each substitution reduced immediate risk while increasing long-term cost. The conflict became less explosive, then suddenly more so, revealing how fragile management without horizon truly was. What the present moment offers, quietly and imperfectly, is not a solution, but a reckoning. A recognition that foundations built for survival must eventually support life, not only defense. That security defined only by force cannot sustain societies indefinitely. That dignity deferred for generations does not disappear, but accumulates pressure. This reckoning does not guarantee change. It creates a choice. The choice is not between perfect peace and inevitable war. That framing has proven too simple and too paralyzing. The real choice is between continued narrowing and cautious widening. Between repeating familiar patterns and risking unfamiliar ones. Widening does not mean forgetting. It means remembering with complexity. It means holding multiple truths without demanding hierarchy. It means acknowledging that suffering does not cancel suffering, and that recognition is not concession. Widening also does not mean immediate resolution. It means choosing directions that preserve future possibility rather than foreclose it. Reducing harm. Expanding agency. Creating conditions in which imagination is not punished as weakness. This work is slow. It happens in classrooms where stories are told with care. In courts where law is debated rather than imposed. in streets where restraint is valued alongside protection, in homes where children learn not only fear but curiosity. It also happens in leadership, when courage is defined not only by toughness, but by responsibility. Responsibility to history, not as burden alone, but as inheritance that can be reshaped. Responsibility to the living, not only the dead. Responsibility to futures not yet formed. The foundation of Israel will always carry its origins. So will Palestinian identity carry its rupture. These facts cannot be undone, and they should not be denied. But foundations do not dictate architecture forever. They support what is built upon them. The question is what societies choose to build next. More walls, higher and thicker, reinforcing the belief that separation is the only form of safety. Or structures that allow contact without erasure, security without domination, dignity without denial. Neither path is free of risk. But one path repeats what is known. The other risks something new. History often changes not when certainty arrives, but when exhaustion forces honesty. When people admit that what they're doing is no longer sustainable, even if alternatives feel unclear. The present moment holds that honesty unevenly. It exists alongside fear, anger, and grief. It competes with voices that promise clarity through force. It is fragile, easily drowned out. Yet it persists, because the cost of ignoring it has become too visible to dismiss entirely. Foundations do not speak. People do. They speak through policy and protest, through silence and story, through what they teach their children and what they demand of their leaders. Over time, these voices shape what a foundation carries forward. Whether the foundation laid in 1948 continues to bear only conflict, or whether it can support something less destructive, depends not on history alone, but on choice. Choice made without certainty. Choice made in the presence of fear. Choice made while carrying memory rather than discarding it. This is not a conclusion. It is a pause. A moment to notice that the ground beneath this conflict, long assumed fixed, is not immutable. That foundations endure, but they do not decide everything. That history presses forward, but does not force repetition without consent. What comes next will be shaped quietly, before it is ever announced loudly. In classrooms and councils. In small decisions and large refusals. In whether societies choose to keep narrowing, or whether, cautiously and imperfectly, they allow space to widen again. Here, the story rests. Not because it has ended, but because it continues beyond any single telling. The foundation remains. What it will carry forward is still being decided, one careful, difficult choice at a time.